For most of human history, survival did not belong to the strongest or the most advanced, but to those who fit quietly into the limits of a place. On a small island, separated by water and time, a group of humans lived in a way that did not follow the path that led to us. Their bodies changed, their world narrowed, and yet they endured long after many others disappeared. This is not a story about progress, but about a different kind of persistence that did not continue. If survival can take more than one form, then why did one of those forms remain isolated? And what does it mean that a strange human species survived on an island until 12,000 years ago? Far from the large continents where human history is often imagined to unfold, there are islands that hold a quieter record of time. These places are shaped by distance, by limited resources, and by boundaries that are not easily crossed. Water, in this sense, is not only a physical barrier but also a filter. It allows some forms of life to arrive and prevents many others from ever reaching the shore. Over long periods, this separation can guide the direction of evolution in ways that do not resemble what happens on the mainland. It is within such a setting that the traces of a small and unusual human population have been found, on an island now known as Flores Island. The island itself sits within a region of deep channels and shifting coastlines, where even during periods of lower sea levels, complete land bridges did not always form. This matters because it suggests that reaching this place was never simple, even in distant prehistory. To arrive there required either a rare crossing event or a sequence of movements that are still not fully understood. What is more certain is that once a group became established on this island, their world began to narrow in a specific way. The landscape offered forests, volcanic ground, and a range of animals that were themselves shaped by isolation. Some species became smaller over generations, a pattern often seen in island environments, while others adapted in different directions. In this context, the human population that lived here did not follow the same trajectory as those on larger landmasses. Their bodies, as reconstructed from fossils, show proportions that are difficult to place within the more familiar patterns of recent human variation. The remains discovered at a cave site known as Liangbua Cave provide the clearest evidence of this difference. Within layers of sediment, archaeologists have uncovered bones that indicate a small-bodied human form, along with simple stone tools and signs of repeated occupation. These findings have been associated with a species named Homo floresiensis. Although the exact classification and its relationship to other human groups continue to be examined with caution, what can be said with more confidence is that this population existed within a confined ecological space for a long span of time, and that their physical characteristics did not align with the larger-bodied humans known from other regions during similar periods. When considering this, it is important to return to the broader origins of the human lineage. Early members of the genus Homo are understood to have emerged in Africa, gradually expanding into new environments over many generations. This movement was not a single event, but a long process shaped by climate shifts, resource availability, and chance. As groups spread into different regions, they encountered new pressures, and their bodies responded over time. On a large continent, there are many paths of movement, many opportunities for exchange, and many ways for populations to merge or separate. On an island, these options become limited. Once a group is established, its future is closely tied to the conditions of that specific place. The evidence from Flores suggests that such a process led to a form of human life that was both connected to the broader human story and distinct from it. Their survival does not necessarily indicate advantage in the usual sense, but rather a sustained balance with a restricted environment. There are no clear signs of rapid technological change, no evidence of expansion beyond the island, and no indication that this population influenced the larger patterns of human migration. Instead, what appears is a long continuity within a narrow range. This continuity becomes more striking when placed against the backdrop of changing climates during the late Pleistocene. As temperatures shifted and sea levels rose and fell, many regions experienced significant ecological transitions. Yet within the protected context of an island, certain conditions may have remained stable enough to support ongoing habitation. The question then begins to form more clearly, not as a statement, but as a quiet uncertainty. If this population was able to persist in such a confined space, shaped by limitations rather than expansion, what does that suggest about the range of possible human forms that once existed? and how many of them left no lasting trace beyond a few fragments of bone and stone. The first important thing to understand about Flores is that an island does not preserve the past in the same way a continent does. A continent allows distance to soften pressure. If food becomes scarce in one region, animals and people can sometimes move. If climate changes, a population may shift toward another valley, another plain, another coastline, but an island narrows every choice. Its mountains, forests, rivers, caves, coastlines, and animals form a closed circle around daily survival. For any human group living there in deep time, the island was not only a home, it was also the outer edge of the possible world. This is why the remains associated with Homo floresiensis are so important. They do not simply show that a small-bodied human once existed. They show that the human story once passed through a place where separation itself became a force. Flores sits east of larger landmasses, within a region where channels of deep water have long divided islands from one another. Even when Ice Age sea levels were lower than they are today, these waters would still have made movement difficult. That detail matters because human origins are often imagined as a widening path, beginning in Africa and stretching outward across continents. Yet on Flores, the path seems to bend inward. It does not point toward expansion, cities, writing, or the later world of Homo sapiens. It points toward a small population living within limits that may have remained in place for many generations. The cave of Liangbua became central to this question because it preserved a set of remains unlike those of recent humans. The bones suggest short stature, a small brain case, and limb proportions that do not fit neatly into the range expected for modern human populations. These features have led many researchers to regard the fossils as evidence of a distinct human species. Though debates have continued about ancestry and interpretation, the safer way to speak about this is not to pretend that every question has been settled. It is more honest to say that the Flores remains reveal a human form that was unexpectedly different, and that this difference cannot be explained away casually. The stone tools found in association with the site show that behavior and body size should not be judged by modern expectations. A small brain case does not mean an empty life. A small body does not mean a simple place in evolution. It means that human variation in the past was broader than the narrow image left by our own survival. This is where the island begins to change the meaning of the evidence. In many island ecosystems, large animals can become smaller over long periods when food, space, and predators create different pressures. Smaller bodies may require less energy. They may fit better into a limited environment. This pattern is known from many animals, but applying it to human evolution must be done carefully. We cannot say with certainty that Homo floresiensis became small only because of island life. We cannot reconstruct every step that led to the body preserved in the cave. Still, the island setting makes the question unavoidable. If a human population was isolated there long enough, and if survival depended on living within a restricted landscape, then evolution may have moved in a direction that looks strange only because we measure it against ourselves. The origin of our own genus was never a straight march toward one final shape. Early humans were already varied. Some were tall, some smaller, some more adapted to open country, others to mixed landscapes. Over time, different groups left Africa and entered Asia, Europe, and islands at the edge of the known prehistoric world. Most of those branches did not continue into the present. Their disappearance does not mean they were failed experiments. It means that survival depends on conditions that change. On Flores, conditions may have allowed one unusual branch to persist for a long time in relative quiet, but persistence inside a boundary is different from lasting forever. A small population can endure for many generations and still remain fragile. A volcanic eruption, a change in rainfall, the loss of key animals, or the arrival of another human group could alter the balance. The evidence does not allow a dramatic certainty about why they vanished. It only allows a more careful thought. A human form can survive in isolation, shaped by the island that holds it, and still leave behind only enough evidence for later minds to wonder how wide the human family once was. The most delicate part of this story is not the small body, or the island, or even the cave. It is time. When Homo floresiensis was first described, one of the most striking ideas was that this unusual human might have survived until very recently in geological terms, close enough to the present to feel almost impossible. A number near 12,000 years ago became attached to the public imagination because it placed this island population almost beside the world of farming, rising seas, and the early steps towards settled life elsewhere. But science does not become stronger by holding on to the most exciting version of a claim. It becomes stronger when the ground beneath that claim is tested again. Later work at Liangbua changed the picture. The layers of the cave were more complicated than they first appeared, and the younger date was no longer treated as the secure endpoint for Homo floresiensis itself. The fossils are now generally understood to be older, and the youngest stone tools connected with the Liangbua sequence are usually placed much earlier than 12,000 years ago. This does not make the story smaller. In a quieter way, it makes the story more honest. The real mystery is not whether we can force this species as close to the present as possible. The real mystery is that a form of human life so different from us could exist on Flores for a long time at all, separated from the main corridors of human history. But while our own ancestors were moving through other landscapes and becoming the only human form left today, that difference between an early dramatic date and a later corrected timeline is important for anyone trying to understand human origins. Our knowledge of the past is not a finished wall. It is more like a cave floor, built in layers, disturbed by erosion, burial, animal movement, water, and the slow accidents of preservation. A fossil does not come with a label explaining its exact place in time. Researchers have to read the sediment around it, test materials that can be dated, compare layers, and return again when something does not fit. On Flores, this process matters because the whole question depends on whether Homo floresiensis truly overlapped with later human worlds or whether their known trace fades earlier. Around the time modern humans were spreading through parts of island Southeast Asia, the evidence cannot support every dramatic possibility equally. It can support a careful image, an island population, small-bodied and anatomically unusual, known from fossil remains and stone tools, whose presence at Liangbua belongs to a deep late Pleistocene world rather than to the doorstep of recorded history. This still places them among the later surviving branches of the human family. It still reminds us that Homo sapiens was not always alone. The beginning of our own kind did not erase all others immediately. For a long time, the Earth held several human ways of being at once, some on open continents, some in colder regions, some perhaps in forests, and one, at least, on a difficult island where water made every arrival rare and every departure uncertain. To imagine Flores correctly, we should not picture a lost tribe waiting at the edge of modern history. We should picture a human population whose world was small in geography, but deep in time. Generation after generation may have lived with the same volcanic ridges, the same cave entrances, the same island animals, the same limits of space and food. Their survival was not a step toward us, and it was not a preview of civilization. It was another branch holding its place under conditions we can only partly reconstruct. The cold truth is that the past does not protect the branches that fascinate us most. It preserves only fragments: a jaw, a skull, a few limb bones, tools in sediment, the absence of later remains where we might wish to find them. From those fragments, the safest story is not the loudest one. It is the one that allows uncertainty to remain visible. Homo floresiensis may not have survived until the very late date once suggested, yet the corrected timeline still leaves us with something profound. On an island far from the usual center of human history, another human form endured long enough to show that evolution did not have only one human answer. And when that answer vanished from the record, it left behind not a clean ending, but a silence shaped like a question. Before we can understand why an island could preserve such an unusual human form, we have to slow down and look at the island itself. Flores is not just a name attached to a fossil. It is a landscape with its own history, its own boundaries, and its own quiet power over every living body that arrives there. The island lies in a region where land and sea have always been closely mixed. During colder periods of the Ice Age, much of the world's water was locked in ice, and sea levels dropped. In many places, this exposed broad shelves of land and allowed animals and humans to move across regions that are now underwater. But Flores remained different. Deep water channels still separated it from the larger landmasses nearby, so the island was never simply a piece of continent waiting to be reached on foot. This detail is central to the story because it means that any early human presence there began with distance, uncertainty, and isolation. The ancestors of the Flores population did not walk into an open plain with endless directions ahead of them. They entered a world where the horizon ended in water. For the human lineage, which began far away in Africa and expanded over immense spans of time, this was a strange kind of narrowing. The same broad movement that carried early humans into Asia may, on Flores, have led into a sealed environment where the rules changed. On a continent, a group can meet other groups, exchange genes, follow herds, leave exhausted ground behind, or disappear into another region. On an island, those choices are reduced. The population must live within the size of the island, the rhythm of rainfall, the available animals, the useful plants, the caves, the slopes, the volcanic soils, and the coastline. Over many generations, these limits do not remain outside the body. They can become part of the conditions under which bodies survive and reproduce. This is one reason island evolution often produces forms that appear surprising when viewed from the mainland. Some large animals become smaller. Some small animals become larger. Some species lose the need for traits that once mattered, while others become more specialized for a narrow world. This does not mean that every island animal changes in the same way, and it does not mean that we can explain Homo floresiensis with one simple rule. But it does mean that Flores gives us a setting where unusual human anatomy is not a random curiosity. It belongs to a place where isolation could make ordinary evolutionary pressures act in concentrated ways. The small-bodied humans known from Liang Bua were not floating outside nature. They were part of an island system that also included extinct dwarf elephants, large birds, reptiles, forests, caves, volcanic activity, and periods of environmental change. When we look at them only as strange human fossils, we miss the deeper point. Their strangeness may partly reflect the island's own logic. A smaller body may need less energy in a limited environment. A stable, restricted landscape may keep a population within a certain range for a long time. A small population may carry traits forward in ways that would be diluted or replaced more easily on a continent. Yet each of these ideas has to be held carefully, because the fossil record is incomplete. We do not have a continuous chain of bodies showing every generation between the first arrival and the later remains at Liang Bua. We have fragments, layers, tools, comparisons, and cautious interpretations. That is enough to show that Flores was not a normal backdrop. It was an active condition of survival. The oldest evidence for hominins on Flores suggests that early humans or human relatives reached the island far earlier than the Liang Bua fossils themselves, and discoveries from another site, Mata Menge, show that small-bodied hominins were present on Flores deep in the past. This makes the island story wider than one cave. It suggests that the small body size associated with the Flores lineage may have had a long history on the island, rather than being a brief late change. For the larger story of human origins, this is important because it weakens the idea that evolution was always moving toward bigger bodies, larger brains, and wider control of the environment. On Flores, a human branch seems to have moved in another direction, not upward or downward, but inward, toward a form fitted to a small world. The island did not need to create a civilization for this to matter. Its importance lies in showing that human evolution once had side paths that could endure quietly outside the main road. The question becomes less about why they were weird, and more about why our own idea of being human became so narrow after every other branch disappeared. An island can make a body look like a decision, even when no one decided anything. Over many generations, the shape of a living creature is pressed by food, danger, distance, climate, and chance. On Flores, these pressures were not spread across a continent. They were gathered into a limited space. The human population known from Liang Bua lived within that space, but the deeper story probably began before the cave itself. Earlier finds from Mata Menge suggest that small-bodied hominins were already present on Flores far back in the island's past. This matters because it makes small body size less like a sudden accident and more like a long condition of island life. The evidence does not let us draw a perfect line from one fossil to the next, and it does not allow a complete family tree, but it does suggest that the strange human form found later at Liang Bua was not simply a brief abnormality. It belonged to a deeper island pattern, one that may have shaped human bodies over a very long time. To understand why this is so important, we have to remember where the human story began. The earliest known members of our broader lineage emerged in Africa, where changing climates, open habitats, wooded areas, and shifting food sources created a wide range of pressures. From that beginning, different human groups spread outward. Some reached Western Asia, some moved farther east, some entered colder regions, some, somehow, reached islands beyond easy walking distance. Each movement carried the human body into a new set of limits. Yet Flores was more than a new landscape. It was a kind of evolutionary container. Once a population was inside it, the ordinary mainland pattern of movement and mixture became weaker. A small group could remain small, traits could persist. Changes could become concentrated. The island did not need to be harsh every day. It only needed to be limited every generation. A body that used less energy may have carried an advantage in such a place, especially if large prey was scarce or unpredictable. A smaller body may have been easier to sustain when the available world was not wide. This idea is often linked to island dwarfism, a known pattern in which some large animals become smaller after long isolation on islands. But for Homo floresiensis, the idea must remain careful. We cannot simply say that island dwarfism explains everything. Their anatomy includes features that raise questions about ancestry, development, and long separation from other human groups. Some traits appear primitive when compared with Homo sapiens. Others are interpreted through the lens of adaptation. The safer truth is that Flores created conditions where a human population could become different enough to unsettle our expectations. The island also held other unusual animals, including dwarf relatives of elephants known as stegodons. Their presence helps us see that the whole ecosystem was shaped by isolation, not just the humans. A small human form, a small elephant relative, restricted land, deep water, volcanic disturbance, and changing forests all belong to the same broad setting. None of these details alone explains the species. Together, they make the species less strange. They show that the island was not a passive stage. It was one of the forces in the story. For a long time, people imagined human evolution as a rise toward larger brains, taller bodies, wider territories, and greater control. Flores asks us to loosen that picture. A human branch could survive by becoming less like that image, not more like it. It could endure by fitting into a reduced world instead of expanding beyond it. This does not mean Homo floresiensis was weak or failed. It means that survival is always local before it becomes historical. A body only has to work where it lives. On Flores, the body that worked may have looked strange to us because our own branch survived elsewhere, under different pressures with different possibilities. The island reminds us that the beginning of humanity did not contain only one destination. It contained many quiet experiments, most of them now gone, and some of them preserved only because a cave floor held their bones long enough for us to find them. To see why Flores matters, it helps to imagine not a single discovery, but a long pressure acting quietly through time. The island did not ask a human body to become impressive in the way later humans often measure impressiveness. It did not reward distance for its own sake, or expansion for its own sake, or the ability to dominate many different environments. It rewarded the ability to remain within a narrow world and keep living there. That is a different measure of survival. On a mainland, a population may be tested by movement. On an island, it may be tested by staying. The land does not grow larger because a group needs more space. The animals do not become more numerous because a season is difficult. The deep water around the shore does not become easier to cross because another valley might be better. Over many generations, these facts can settle into the ordinary conditions of life. They do not need to appear dramatic. They become the background against which every birth, every childhood, every search for food, and every loss takes place. When we place Homo floresiensis inside this kind of world, the word strange begins to change. Strange compared to what? Strange compared to modern humans? Yes. Strange compared to the large-brained image that many people still carry when they think about evolution? Yes. But not necessarily strange compared to the island that shaped them. Their small bodies, their unusual proportions, and their long presence on Flores may be telling us that the human family once had ways of surviving that were not pointed toward becoming us. This is one of the most important ideas to hold gently. Human origins began with a branching process, not a single road. From Africa, different forms of humans and human relatives moved into different landscapes, and those landscapes did not all ask the same question of the body. Some environments favored mobility across wide distances, some favored endurance in cold, some favored flexible diets, some may have favored social exchange across larger populations. Flores, because of its isolation, may have asked a quieter question. Can a human population persist when the world available to it is small, bounded, and difficult to leave? The answer, written only in fragments, seems to be yes for a long time. But the same answer also contains a warning. Island survival can be stable and fragile at the same time. A small population can fit its environment closely, but close fit can become danger when the environment shifts. A volcanic event, a change in vegetation, a decline in certain animals, a new competitor, or the arrival of Homo sapiens could all have mattered. The evidence does not allow us to choose one cause with confidence. It would be false to turn their disappearance into a simple story. What we can say is that the island that may have helped preserve their difference may also have limited their options when conditions changed. This is why Flores feels so important to the larger human story. It shows that isolation can protect a branch from being absorbed, but it can also leave that branch with fewer ways to recover. On a continent, when one region becomes difficult, there may be another. On Flores, another world was not just across a plain, it was across water. In this sense, the island was both shelter and boundary. It held them apart from the wider human current, and by holding them apart, it allowed their difference to remain visible in the fossil record. The cave at Liangbua is not only a place of bones, it is a place where the idea of humanity becomes wider for a moment. A small skull can force a large question. A few tools in sediment can disturb an old assumption. The absence of a clean ending can remind us that prehistory is not a story that exists for our comfort. We should not imagine Homo floresiensis as a failed version of ourselves, or as a mysterious people with thoughts we can invent. We should see them more carefully, as a human population known through limited evidence, living in an island world that made certain forms of life possible and others unlikely. Their existence tells us that being human was once not a single shape, not a single future, and not a single measure of success. Our own survival has made the past appear narrower than it was. Because we are the only human species left, we easily mistake our bodies, our minds, and our history for the natural endpoint of everything before us. Flores corrects that mistake without needing to shout. It offers a quieter lesson. Evolution does not move toward the form that later tells the story. It moves through conditions, accidents, separations, and fragile continuities. A small island in Southeast Asia kept one of those continuities long enough for stone and bone to reach us. What remains is not a complete life, not a full society, not a confident ending, but a boundary in human memory. There was once another way for a human body to belong to the earth, and it belonged to an island. A cave is not only an empty place in stone. In prehistory, a cave can become a slow container of accidents. Dust settles there, ash settles there. Bones are carried in, left behind, buried, uncovered, broken, and covered again. Water moves through the floor. Animals enter and leave. Humans may return again and again, not because the cave is special in a modern sense, but because it offers shelter, shade, visibility, or a dry place near a useful landscape. Liangbua, on Flores, matters because its floor held a record dense enough to disturb the simple picture of human history. The discovery of small human remains there did not begin as a complete answer. It began as a problem. The bones were not large. The skull was not shaped like the skull of a recent human child. The body did not match the ordinary expectation of an adult Homo sapiens. Yet the remains were found in an archaeological setting, in a cave, where stone tools and traces of repeated activity showed that humans or human relatives had used the place. This combination forced a careful question. Was this a modern human with an unusual condition, or was it evidence of a different kind of human altogether? Over time, many researchers came to support the interpretation that the fossils represented a distinct species, Homo floresiensis. That conclusion did not rest on one dramatic feature alone. It came from the pattern of many features together: small body size, small cranial capacity, unusual limb proportions, and traits that seemed difficult to place inside normal modern human variation. The importance of the cave is that it made this pattern visible. Without Liangbua, the island might have remained only a place where older stone tools hinted at an early human presence. With Liangbua, the story became more intimate. A body appeared. Not a whole life, not a voice, not a culture we can freely reconstruct, but enough anatomy to show that the human family had once included a form far outside the narrow range left on Earth today. This is where the origin of humanity must be brought back into the room. Our own species did not rise alone in an empty world. The deeper past was shared. Different human groups existed across Africa and Eurasia at different times, and the line leading to Homo sapiens was only one surviving thread among several. When modern people look backward, we often see history from the side of the winner, because only our branch remained to ask the question. Liangbua interrupts that habit. It places another human form before us, not as a myth, not as a monster, and not as a failed version of ourselves, but as evidence that evolution once allowed human life to occupy more than one shape. The cave also teaches caution. Fossils are not sentences written for us. They are fragments of bodies removed from their living context. A skull cannot tell us what someone feared. A leg bone cannot tell us how a group understood the world. A tool cannot prove a full way of thinking. What the evidence can do is narrower and more valuable. It can show presence. It can show anatomy. It can show that stone was being worked. It can show that the cave was used over time. It can show that an island held a human population different from ours. The rest must be approached slowly. This is especially important because the story has often been presented in a way that makes strangeness louder than evidence. A small human species on an island sounds almost unreal, but the careful version is stronger than the exciting version. The careful version says that Flores preserved remains of a small-bodied hominin whose anatomy led to the naming of Homo floresiensis, and whose exact ancestry is still discussed. It says that the island context may help explain some of their difference, but it does not solve every problem. It says that their known record belongs to a deep prehistoric world, not to a fantasy of hidden survivors. The more closely we stay with the cave, the less we need exaggeration. Liangbua is already strange enough because it shows that the past was wider than our imagination. Beneath the quiet floor of one cave, the human story did not look like a straight road. It looked like a branching memory, with one branch small, isolated, and real enough to leave bone in the dark. The bones from Liangbua matter because they ask for a kind of patience that human curiosity does not always enjoy. When people hear that a strange human lived on an island, the mind wants a full picture immediately. It wants a face, a family, a language, a scene beside a fire, a clear ending, and a reason for disappearance. But the cave does not give that kind of certainty. It gives fragments. A skull, teeth, parts of arms and legs, stone tools, animal bones, layers of earth, and the difficult relationship between all of them. Each fragment is real, but none of them can carry the whole story alone. This is why the discovery became so important. It did not simply add another fossil to a list. It forced researchers to ask how much difference can exist inside the human family before we stop calling it variation and begin calling it another branch. The remains associated with Homo floresiensis show a small adult body and a small brain case, yet they appear in a setting where tool-making was present. That combination matters because it breaks a simple habit in the way many people imagine human origins. We often connect bigger brains with better survival, taller bodies with advancement, and technological traces with a form close to ourselves. Flores weakens that chain. It shows that a human population could be small, anatomically unusual, and still part of a long survival story. The cave does not let us reduce them to a curiosity. It asks us to separate evidence from assumption. A small skull does not tell us that life was simple. A stone flake does not tell us that thought was modern. A cave floor does not tell us how people saw themselves. What it does tell us is that human evolution once had combinations that feel unfamiliar from the narrow perspective of the present. This is directly tied to the deeper beginning of the human line. Long before Homo sapiens became the only surviving human species, The genus Homo was already spreading, dividing, adapting, and disappearing in different places. Africa was the starting region for our broader story, but it was not the final boundary of human possibility. When human relatives moved outward, they entered deserts, grasslands, forests, cold regions, coastlines, and islands. Each place changed the terms of survival. Liangbua is powerful because it preserves the result of one of those terms, isolation on Flores. The people represented by the fossils were not part of a large, open population constantly mixing across continents. They seem to have belonged to a much more restricted setting, where the island itself may have shaped anatomy and continuity, yet the cave also reminds us that preservation is uneven. We may have only a few representatives of a population that lasted far longer than the fossils can show. We may be seeing a small window, not the full house. This makes every confident statement dangerous if it goes beyond the evidence. It is safer to say that the fossils reveal a small-bodied hominin, that many anatomical features support recognition as a distinct species, and that the exact path leading to that species remains debated. Some researchers have compared Homo floresiensis with early Homo forms. Others have examined whether their features could be explained within unusual modern human variation. The wider scientific view has generally favoured their distinct status, but the careful tone still matters because science is not a performance of certainty. It is a method for keeping claims tied to what can be checked. The deeper value of Liangbua is that it makes humility necessary. A cave on one island can correct a grand story told from the viewpoint of the survivor. If Homo sapiens had vanished and another human form had remained, perhaps our own bodies would have looked strange in their museums. Our tall limbs, rounded skulls, large brains, and restless movement across landscapes might have seemed like one local experiment among many. Because we are here, we often forget that our form was not guaranteed. The Flores fossils place that forgotten truth in bone. They show that human history was not only a rise toward us, but also a field of different answers to the problem of living. Some answers were continental, some were cold adapted, some were mixed through contact and movement. One answer, preserved in Liangbua, was small, island-bound, and difficult to fit into old categories. This is why the cave floor matters more than any dramatic phrase attached to the discovery. It is not a doorway into fantasy. It is a boundary between what can be known and what must remain open. We can stand near that boundary and see enough to be changed by it. The human past was wider, quieter, and less obedient to our expectations than the present makes it seem. On Flores, the evidence does not shout. It waits in stone and sediment, reminding us that one of the strangest things about being human is how many human ways of being disappeared before anyone could remember them. Liangbua matters because it turns the human past from a clean line into a wider and less comfortable shape. Before the Flores discovery became known, many people could still imagine recent human evolution as a story moving almost neatly toward us. Older human relatives belonged far back in time. Neanderthals stood closer. Modern humans arrived, spread, and became the last remaining branch. But the cave on Flores weakened that simple picture. It placed a small-bodied human form in a late prehistoric island world, Comparity, with bones that did not fit easily inside the familiar range of Homo sapiens. The discovery did not need dramatic language to be unsettling. A skull, teeth, limb bones, stone tools and cave layers were enough. They showed that another human form had once lived in a real landscape, under real limits, far from the main continental routes where our own story is usually told. This is why Liangbua is not only a fossil site, it is a correction to the way memory works. Because Homo sapiens is the only human species alive today, the past can appear narrower than it truly was. We easily treat our body, our brain, and our history as if they were the natural direction of evolution. Flores asks us to be more careful. The small skull from Liangbua does not show a failed human. It shows a different human possibility, preserved by chance in a cave floor. Its meaning comes not from fantasy, but from the fact that the evidence is limited and still powerful. The cave gives us anatomy, tools, sediment, and revised dates. It does not give us thoughts, language, beliefs, or a complete picture of daily life. That boundary matters. If we cross it too quickly, we stop telling prehistory and begin inventing it. The safer story is also the deeper one. Homo floresiensis reminds us that the human family once had more than one answer to the problem of living. Some answers unfolded across open land. Some developed in colder places. Some were shaped by contact with other groups. One answer, preserved on Flores, seems to have been shaped by isolation, small population size, limited resources, and a world surrounded by water. This does not mean every feature of the body can be explained by island life alone. It means the island gives the discovery its proper frame. A body that seems strange beside modern humans may make more sense inside a small and separated ecosystem. The beginning of our own lineage, far back in Africa, did not contain a single guaranteed ending. It produced movement, branching, separation, and loss. Over immense time, different human groups entered different places, and those places changed what survival required. Liang Bua lets us see one of those lost requirements only in outline. It does not show a people waiting near modern history, and it should not be treated as proof of a hidden surviving group. It shows something quieter, a human branch that endured long enough on Flores to leave traces, then disappeared from the record without giving us a clear final cause. That silence is part of the truth. A volcano may have mattered. Ecological change may have mattered. The arrival of modern humans may have mattered. Several pressures may have met at once. The evidence does not let us close the case with confidence. What it does allow is a more humble view of ourselves. We are not the measure by which every earlier human form should be judged. We are the remaining branch, looking back through a broken record. In Liang Bua, a few bones make that record wider. They remind us that human evolution was not a staircase rising toward the present, but a set of paths shaped by land, water, chance, and disappearance. On Flores, one of those paths entered the dark of a cave and left behind enough to disturb the story, but not enough to finish it. The body of Homo floresiensis is often the first thing people remember, because it seems to pull against a common expectation. Many people still imagine human evolution as a long movement toward taller bodies, larger brains, and greater control over the world. Flores does not fit that simple image. The fossils from Liang Bua suggest a small adult body, a small brain case, and limb proportions that do not match modern human anatomy in an easy way. But the safest way to understand this body is not to treat it as a spectacle. It should be treated as evidence. A body is a record of pressures, ancestry, development, and environment. It carries the history of a population without explaining every step of that history. In the case of Homo floresiensis, the body tells us that the human family once included forms that would seem unexpected if we only used ourselves as the standard. This matters because our own origin was not a straight climb toward one final design. The early human lineage began in Africa, and over long stretches of time, different human groups moved into new regions. Each region asked different things of the body. A body that works well in one place may not be the best body somewhere else. On a wide continent, size, movement, contact with other groups, and access to many kinds of resources can shape survival one way. On an island like Flores, the pressures may be different. Food, space, animal communities, and population size are all limited in a way that can persist generation after generation. This does not mean the island alone explains every feature of Homo floresiensis. That would be too simple. But it does mean that small body size should not be dismissed as weakness. In a restricted environment, a smaller body can sometimes be part of a workable balance, because it may require less energy and fit better within a narrow ecological world. This idea is familiar from island animals where large species sometimes become smaller over time. Yet with a human species, caution is necessary. We do not have every generation preserved. We do not know the full path from the first hominin arrival on Flores to the later remains at Liang Bua. We cannot point to one bone and say the whole story is solved. What we can say is that the body of Homo floresiensis makes the old ladder of progress feel too narrow. A small brain case does not allow us to invent a poor life. A short body does not allow us to assume failure. The presence of stone tools near the Flores evidence reminds us that behavior and anatomy do not always fit modern expectations. Human life in the deep past was not measured by whether it looked like us. It was measured by whether a population could continue under the conditions it faced. The unusual body from Flores may reflect deep ancestry, island adaptation, population isolation, or some combination that remains debated. Its meaning is strongest when we allow these possibilities to remain open, rather than forcing them into one dramatic answer. This is also where the body becomes more than a biological detail. It becomes a challenge to human memory. Because Homo sapiens survived, our form now feels normal, but normal is not the same as inevitable. If another branch had survived instead, our tall bodies and large rounded skulls might have seemed strange to them. Flores lets us imagine that reversal without turning it into fantasy. It shows that one human form could be small, isolated, and enduring, while another human form, ours, was spreading across wider regions. Both belong to the same broad history of human origins, but they answer different environments in different ways. The body of Homo floresiensis is therefore not a mistake in the human story. It is a reminder that the story was once wider than the body we now carry. A small brain is one of the hardest details to discuss calmly, because modern people often connect brain size with worth, intelligence, or success. That habit can make the Flores discovery easy to misunderstand. The brain case of Homo floresiensis was small compared with that of Homo sapiens, but this fact alone does not give us permission to rank an entire life. A fossil skull can tell us about shape and volume. It cannot tell us how a group remembered places, shared skills, recognized danger, or moved through a familiar landscape. Those questions are more complex than one measurement. The safer point is that Homo floresiensis forces us to separate brain size from the old idea of a simple evolutionary ladder. Human origins did involve changes in brain size across some branches, but the wider story was never only about getting bigger. It was also about bodies meeting environments, populations becoming separated, and survival taking local forms. On Flores, a small-bodied human population appears to have lived in an island setting for a long time. The evidence of stone tools shows that the relationship between body, brain, and behavior cannot be flattened into one easy rule. We should not imagine modern thought inside them, but we also should not assume emptiness because their skull was small. The cave gives a narrower truth. A small-brained hominin existed there, made or used stone tools, and belonged to a real human branch that survived outside the path leading directly to us. This is where the island matters again. A brain is an expensive organ. In living animals, nervous tissue requires energy, and energy is never abstract. It comes from food gathered in a particular place. On an island with limited resources, body size and energy demand may become important across generations. Some researchers have considered whether reduced body size and reduced brain size could be connected to island conditions, though the exact process remains debated. It would be unsafe to claim that Flores alone explains everything. Yet, it is reasonable to say that a restricted environment changes the question. Instead of asking why this human species did not become more like us, we can ask what kind of body could remain viable in that place. This shift is important for the whole human story. Our ancestors and relatives did not move through a world that rewarded one body plan everywhere. A large brain may help in some conditions, but it also has costs. A large body may help in some settings, but it also requires more food. A smaller form may seem surprising to us because our branch survived with a different balance. But evolution does not choose what later viewers admire. It works through reproduction, survival, limits, and chance. The brain of Homo floresiensis, therefore, should not be treated as an insult or a miracle. It should be treated as a clue. It points toward a human form whose life was organized under conditions we can only partly see. The beginning of humanity was not a promise that every branch would move toward the same anatomy. It was a branching field, and Flores preserved one branch that followed a different balance of body and brain. This balance may look strange from the present, but it was not strange to the island. It belonged to the pressures of that world, the food available there, the animals around it, the small population behind it, and the deep water that kept it apart. In the end, the small brain of Homo floresiensis does not make the species less important. It makes the discovery more important, because it proves how narrow our expectations have been. Human life once existed in forms that do not match the body we know from the mirror. Some of those forms carried large brains. Some carried smaller ones. Some lived across continents. One endured on Flores, leaving behind a skull that does not answer everything, but quietly asks why we ever thought there was only one proper way to be human. The limbs of Homo floresiensis add another layer to the quiet disturbance caused by the Flores fossils. A body is not only a skull, it is a whole arrangement of movement, balance, reach, weight and habit shaped across generations. The remains from Liangbua suggest proportions that do not sit comfortably inside the pattern of modern humans. Some features appear unusual when compared with Homo sapiens, and some have been discussed as more primitive in form. This does not allow us to rebuild their lives in detail. It does not tell us how fast they moved, how they carried things, or how they experienced the island around them. But it does tell us that the human body once had more possible arrangements than the one that survived into the present. That idea matters because modern people often treat the body as if it has a single, correct human form. We look at our own long legs, upright posture, rounded skull, and flexible hands, then quietly place other forms below us. Flores makes that habit less secure. The body found there was not a broken version of ours. It was part of another human branch, carrying its own history through bone. To understand this properly, we have to return again to the beginning of the human story. Early humans did not emerge with one finished body plan and then simply spread across the earth. They changed through time, and different populations carried different combinations of traits. Some traits were inherited from older ancestors. Some were shaped by new environments. Some may have remained because small populations can preserve features that larger, mixed populations might lose or dilute. On Flores, separation could make these effects stronger. The island did not only limit movement across water, it may also have limited the number of people, the number of outside contacts, and the amount of genetic exchange with other groups. In that kind of setting, a body can become a record of both ancestry and isolation. This is why the limbs of Homo floresiensis should be read slowly. They are not a clue to a simple ranking. They are a clue to a different evolutionary path. The feet, arms, shoulders, hands, and legs of any human form are shaped by practical demands. They belong to walking, climbing, reaching, carrying, making, resting, and moving through uneven ground. Flores was not an empty laboratory. It had slopes, forests, volcanic landscapes, caves, animals, wet seasons, dry periods, and coastlines. A human body there would have lived inside those textures, not outside them. Yet we must avoid saying more than the evidence allows. We cannot describe their daily movements with certainty. We cannot claim to know their posture in life beyond what anatomy suggests. We cannot turn a few bones into a complete scene. What we can say is more limited and more valuable. Their anatomy shows that human evolution did not keep only the forms most familiar to us. It kept many forms for a time, then lost most of them. The Flores body may carry signs of deep ancestry, island adaptation, and long separation all at once. That mixture is difficult because evolution rarely leaves clean labels. A bone does not say whether it is primitive, adaptive, accidental, or all of these in different degrees. Researchers must compare, measure, debate, and revise. The listener should not be asked to accept a fantasy. The listener should be invited to sit with the real uncertainty. The body of Homo floresiensis was small, unusual, and human in the broad evolutionary sense. It belonged to a population that endured on an island beyond easy reach. It reminds us that our own body is not the final answer written into nature from the beginning. It is only the answer that remains. Somewhere on Flores, another answer once walked over volcanic ground, entered caves, used stone, and left behind enough bone for us to understand that human form was once wider than human memory. Stone tools make the Flores story more difficult, because they prevent us from treating Homo floresiensis as only a strange body. A fossil can show anatomy, but a tool shows contact between body, material, and repeated action. It does not reveal a full mind. It does not tell us language, memory, belief, or social life. But it does show that stone was selected, struck, shaped, and used in ways that mattered to survival. At Liangbua, stone artifacts appear in the archaeological layers connected with the wider hominin presence on Flores. Older evidence from other sites on the island also shows that hominins were making stone tools long before the Liangbua fossils themselves. This means the story of Flores is not only a story of bones in a cave, it is also a story of hands meeting stone across deep time. That matters because modern people often imagine tools as a ladder leading upward toward us. Simple flakes are placed near the bottom, polished tools higher, metal later, machines at the top. But this ladder can mislead us when we look into prehistory. A tool does not need to look impressive to be useful. A sharp flake can cut. A core can be struck again. A small tool can serve a local task in a local world. For a population living within the limits of an island, the value of a tool was not measured by whether it would impress later humans. It was measured by whether it worked where it was made. This is where the beginning of the human story returns again. Early members of the genus Homo are closely associated with stone tool use, and the making of tools became one of the durable traces by which archaeologists follow human presence across landscapes. When humans or human relatives moved out of Africa and into new regions, their bones did not always preserve. Their camps did not always survive. Their bodies disappeared into soil, water, heat, and time. Stone, however, can remain. It can outlast flesh, wood, skin, and voice. On Flores, stone tools help extend the human record beyond the few bodies known from Liangbua. They suggest continuity of behavior on the island, though not always with a simple direct line from one group to another. This caution is important. A stone tool does not automatically identify the species that made it unless the context is clear. Similar-looking tools can be made by different human groups. The safest statement is that stone artifacts show hominin activity, and at Liangbua they form part of the evidence surrounding Homo floresiensis. They do not let us reconstruct a complete culture. They do not prove that these humans thought like us. But they do show that small body size and small brain size did not prevent practical engagement with the material world. The island environment gives this evidence a quieter meaning. Flores offered stone, animals, caves, forests, and coastlines, but all within a limited geography. In such a setting, tool-making may have been less about constant invention and more about steady adequacy. A technique can persist when it meets the needs of a place. It does not have to change quickly to be meaningful. The absence of spectacular technology should not be treated as absence of life. It may reflect a population whose tools were fitted to a narrow world, where repetition mattered more than novelty. For Homo sapiens, later technological change became one of the visible forces of expansion. For Homo floresiensis, the visible trace is quieter. Stone worked by hands that belong to another human form. Those tools do not answer the whole mystery, but they keep the mystery grounded. They remind us that the strange species on Flores was not only preserved in bone, it also touched the island, struck stone, and left behind marks of action in a world that did not continue into ours. A stone tool is quiet evidence because it does not explain itself. It can sit in the ground for thousands of years with no memory of the hand that made it, no name, no voice, no scene around it. Yet it still carries a human kind of trace. A flake broken from a core is not only a broken stone, it is a sign that material was recognized, held, struck, and turned into an edge. On Flores, this matters deeply because the body of Homo floresiensis can easily take all attention away from behavior. The small skull and unusual limbs make people ask what kind of human this was. The tools ask a different question. What did survival require in a small island world, and how did hands answer that requirement again and again? The answer should be kept modest. We cannot describe the full tool-making tradition of Homo floresiensis as if we had watched it. We cannot say what they intended beyond the practical possibilities suggested by the artifacts. But the presence of stone tools near the Flores evidence keeps the species connected to a wider human pattern. From the early beginnings of the genus Homo in Africa, stone tool use became one of the strongest signals that a body was engaging with the world in a learned and repeated way. As human relatives moved into Asia and beyond, stone remained one of the few materials strong enough to survive, after wood, plant fiber, skin, and bone had often vanished. This means the Flores tools are not just objects, they are part of the long record of how human life entered landscapes and left marks. Still, the tools from Flores should not be forced into a story of progress. It would be easy to say that because the tools were simple, the life behind them was simple. That would be a mistake. A tool is simple only when judged from far away. In the hand, in the moment of need, a sharp edge can be enough. It can cut meat, process plants, scrape material, or perform tasks that leave little direct evidence. The tool does not need to become more complex if the older form continues to work. On an island, where resources and movements may have remained limited, a stable tool habit could be a sign of fit rather than failure. The same action repeated over generations may look plain in the ground, but repetition is often how survival stays alive. This is another way Flores changes the human story. Our own species became known for wide movement, growing technological variety, and later cultural complexity. But that path was not the only possible human path. Homo floresiensis appears to show that a human branch could endure with a smaller body, a smaller brain case, and a practical stone technology that did not need to resemble later human invention. The connection between tools and intelligence must therefore be handled carefully. Tools prove action. They do not prove modern thought. They show skill, but not the full inner life of the makers. They show that the island was not only endured passively, it was worked with. Stone was turned into edge, edge was brought into daily survival. The exact tasks are partly hidden, but the pattern is enough to matter. In the broader origin of humanity, toolmaking was never separate from place. A stone flake made in Africa, a core reduced in Asia, and an artifact left inside Liangbua all belong to different worlds, but they share one deep connection: the body extending itself through material. On Flores, that extension happened in a restricted island setting, far from the larger movements that shaped Homo sapiens. The tools do not make Homo floresiensis less mysterious. They make the mystery more grounded. They tell us that this was not only an unusual skeleton preserved by chance. It was a living branch that touched stone, changed it, and left behind the smallest durable signs of work before the island silence closed around it. The deepest value of the Flores tools is that they keep the story close to the ground. Without them, Homo floresiensis might be remembered only as a strange set of bones, separated from life by museum glass and measurement. With them, the body returns to an island surface. Hands meet stone. Stone meets pressure. An edge appears where there was no edge before. This does not allow us to invent scenes that the evidence cannot support, but it does allow one careful truth. These were not only bodies shaped by isolation. They were bodies acting within isolation. They lived in a place where survival had to be made from what the island offered, and stone was one of the materials that could hold the trace of that making. This matters because the human story began not with cities or writing, but with bodies learning landscapes. Long before Homo sapiens became the only human species left, earlier humans and human relatives were already using stone, bone, wood, fire in some contexts, and memory of place to survive. Most of those materials vanished easily. Stone remained. It became one of the few witnesses strong enough to survive time. On Flores, stone tools remind us that the island population belonged to that wider human pattern, even if their bodies followed a path very different from ours. The tools do not erase the mystery of the small brain case. They make it more interesting. They show that practical behavior cannot be read from brain size alone. A smaller brain does not let us assume a lifeless mind, and a tool does not let us assume a modern one. Between those two errors is the safer space, where the real story rests. Homo floresiensis seems to have lived with a practical relationship to stone, and that relationship was enough to leave repeated traces in the archaeological record. The simplicity of the tools should also be understood with care. In deep prehistory, a tool did not need to become complex for the sake of looking advanced. It needed to solve a problem. A flake that cuts well is not primitive in the moment it is useful. A core that can be struck again is not poor technology if it works in the place where it is made. On an island, this point becomes even stronger. Flores was not a world of endless materials and endless movement. It was a bounded place. If a method worked within that boundary, there may have been little pressure for visible change. Stability in tools can look like stillness to us, but for a small population, stillness may also mean continuity. The same gesture, passed across generations, can be a form of survival. Yet caution must remain. Stone tools do not tell us who taught whom. They do not tell us whether knowledge moved through families, small groups, or repeated observation. They do not tell us what was remembered at night inside the cave, or whether the makers understood the island in ways we would recognize. Those things are beyond the evidence. What remains is humbler and more durable. A stone was changed by a hominin hand. That changed stone entered the record. Many ages later, it helps us understand that this island species was not merely an anatomical puzzle. It was part of the long human habit of extending the body through objects. From the early origins of the genus Homo in Africa to distant island settings in Southeast Asia, stone tools form a thin but continuous thread. They do not make every human group the same. They show how different groups met the world through material action. On Flores, that action happened under the pressure of separation. The island limited movement, but it did not stop making. It narrowed the world, but it did not erase response. This is why the tools matter so much. They hold the quiet proof that another human branch did not only survive as bone, it worked within a small world, left edges in stone, and gave the past one more way to tell us that being human was once wider than one surviving species. One of the quietest dangers in telling the story of Homo floresiensis is imagining the island as empty except for them. No human branch lives outside an ecosystem. Every body is surrounded by other bodies, other hungers, other movements, and other limits. Flores was not just a small piece of land holding a strange human species. It was a living world with animals, plants, volcanic ground, caves, wet seasons, dry seasons, and coastlines shaped by deep water. To understand how a small human population could endure there, we have to place it among the other life forms that shared the island. The evidence from Flores includes extinct animals, among them dwarf relatives of elephants known as stegodons, as well as large birds and reptiles. These animals should not be used to create a dramatic fantasy of danger, but they do remind us that the island had its own balance. Homo floresiensis was not standing above that balance like a ruler. It was inside it. This is important because human origins are often told as a story of control. Humans master fire, make tools, move outward, hunt, build, and eventually dominate landscapes. But Flores suggests a different tone. There. Survival may have depended less on control and more on fitting into a confined system. A small island does not give endless choices. If certain animals decline, if vegetation changes, if volcanic ash covers land, if rainfall shifts, the whole web can tighten. A small human population living inside such a web would have been affected by changes that might seem minor on a continent. This does not mean we know exactly what they ate or how often they encountered particular animals. The record is incomplete, and it would be unsafe to turn bones in the ground into confident scenes of daily life. What we can say is that their world included other island species that were also shaped by isolation. That shared setting matters. The same conditions that may have favoured small body size in some animals may help frame the unusual body of Homo floresiensis. The island was not producing copies of mainland life, it was changing life through limits. This returns us to the beginning of the human story, because early humans did not evolve apart from animals and landscapes. They emerged within ecosystems, following food, avoiding danger, learning terrain, and responding to climate. From Africa outward, human relatives entered worlds already full of other life. Each place set a different range of possible survival. Flores was one of the most restricted of those places. A human branch there would have had to live beside animals that were not simply background, but part of the same pressure system. Stegodons, for example, are important not because they make the story more exciting, but because they show how island evolution can reshape large mammals. Their presence gives the Flores world a more concrete form. It was a place where size, food, reproduction, and isolation were all connected. If Homo floresiensis hunted, scavenged, gathered, avoided, or competed in ways we can only partly infer, those actions happened within this island ecology. The cave record does not allow a full picture, but it gives enough to prevent us from imagining them as detached from nature. They were not symbols, they were living organisms in a small world. Their survival, for however long the known evidence supports, depended on relationships with land, animals, plants, stone, and water. The tragedy of such a system is that close balance can last for many generations and still be vulnerable. If one part changes, the effects can move through the whole island. This is why the ecosystem of Flores is not a side detail. It is part of the answer to why this human form could endure there, and why endurance did not guarantee permanence. The animals of Flores help us understand the island as a living pressure, not a quiet background. In a mainland landscape, animal communities can stretch across wide territories, herds can move, predators can follow, plants can shift across large ranges as climate changes. On Flores, every relationship was held inside a smaller frame. This does not mean the island was simple. A small place can still contain forests, slopes, caves, rivers, dry ground, wet ground, and different animal paths. But it does mean that the balance between species may have been more easily disturbed. For Homo floresiensis, this matters because survival was not only a matter of having a body or making stone tools, it was a matter of living inside a web of other island lives. The extinct stegodons of Flores are especially useful for thinking about this web. They were relatives of elephants, and on islands some large mammals are known to become smaller over long periods. Their reduced size does not make them less important. It shows how isolation can change the normal scale of life. A smaller elephant relative and a small-bodied human form on the same island do not prove one simple cause for everything, but together they make the island pattern visible. Flores was a place where bodies could shift under the pressure of limited land, limited food, and long separation from mainland populations. This is where the human origin story becomes less like a ladder and more like a set of local experiments. Early humans and their relatives did not move through empty worlds. They entered ecosystems that were already alive with other animals. A human body had to fit into those systems before it could leave any trace in history. On Flores, fitting in may have meant living with animals that were themselves unusual by mainland standards. There may have been opportunities for food, dangers to avoid, materials to use, and seasonal changes to remember. But caution is necessary. We cannot confidently describe a typical day of Homo floresiensis. We cannot say exactly how often they hunted, scavenged, gathered, or moved through particular habitats. The bones of animals and the tools of hominins can suggest relationships, but they do not let us watch life directly. The honest picture is more restrained. Homo floresiensis lived in an island ecosystem that included other species shaped by isolation, and that ecosystem helped define the conditions under which survival was possible. The island also reminds us that ecological balance can be narrow without looking dramatic. A small population can continue for many generations while depending on a small number of stable resources. If one important animal becomes rare, if vegetation changes, if volcanic activity damages part of the landscape, or if climate shifts the rhythm of water and food, the effect may travel through the whole island. On a continent, a group might follow new resources across distance. On Flores, distance ended at the shore. The same water that protected isolation also limited escape. This is why the animal world of Flores belongs directly to the mystery of Homo floresiensis. It helps explain how a different human form could remain in place for so long, and why that same place could become dangerous if the balance changed. In the broader history of our genus, survival was always ecological before it became historical. A species does not survive because it is interesting to later humans. It survives because births continue, food is found, dangers are managed, and enough young live long enough to become the next generation. The Flores fossils and tools give only a partial view of that process, but the island animals make the setting more complete. They show that Homo floresiensis was one member of a small, changing world, not an isolated miracle. Their story belongs to bones, stone, water, forests, volcanic ground, and extinct animals whose own histories ended too. When we remember that, the island becomes quieter and more serious. It was not a stage for a strange species. It was the shared world that made their survival possible until it no longer did. A closed ecosystem can feel stable from far away, but stability on an island is often a delicate thing. Flores may have allowed Homo floresiensis to endure because its limits created a world that could be learned, repeated, and lived within for many generations. The same paths, the same caves, the same sources of stone, the same animal movements, and the same seasonal rhythms may have formed a pattern strong enough to support a small population. Yet that kind of survival is never the same as safety. A population can be well fitted to its world and still be vulnerable precisely because the world is small. If a key animal declines, there may be no distant herd to follow. If a familiar habitat changes, there may be no broad plain beyond the next ridge. If volcanic activity damages part of the island, the effects do not remain abstract. They enter food, water, shelter, and movement. This is why the ecosystem of Flores belongs directly to the question of how another human species could last there. It was not only a place that shaped them, it was also a place that held them inside a narrow balance. The animal remains associated with the island help us see this more clearly. Extinct stegodons, large birds, reptiles, and other island life were not decorations around the human story. They were part of the same network of pressures. Some may have been food sources, some may have been dangers, some may have shaped where humans moved, where they rested, and how they used stone tools. But the evidence does not allow us to turn this into a detailed drama. We should not imagine every encounter or assign emotions to the people who lived there. The safer truth is that Homo floresiensis survived among other species that were also shaped by isolation, and when those relationships changed, the human population would have felt the change too. This brings the story back to the deeper beginning of humanity. Early human relatives did not become human by standing outside nature. They became human within nature, under pressure from climates, animals, plants, landscapes, and other groups. From Africa outward, each movement into a new place created a new test of the body and behavior. Flores was one of the most unusual tests because water made the island difficult to enter and difficult to leave. The same isolation that may have protected a distinct human branch from being absorbed into larger populations may also have made that branch more exposed to local collapse. This is one of the quiet contradictions at the heart of the Flores story. Isolation can preserve difference, but it can also reduce escape. A small island can hold a species for a long time, but it can also leave that species with few alternatives when the pattern changes. We do not know the final cause of disappearance with certainty. It may have involved environmental change, volcanic disturbance, loss of important animals, contact with modern humans, or several pressures acting together. A responsible story should not choose one cause simply because it feels satisfying. The value of Flores is that it teaches a slower lesson. Survival is not a trophy given to the most advanced form. It is a relationship between a population and the world around it. For Homo floresiensis, that relationship lasted long enough to leave fossils, tools, and questions. Then the relationship ended, or at least disappeared from the record. What remains is a small island ecosystem speaking through broken evidence. It tells us that another human branch once lived within a web of animals, stone, water, forest, and volcanic ground. It also tells us that being well adapted to a place does not mean being protected from time. Sometimes the same boundary that allows a human form to continue is the boundary that leaves it with nowhere else to go. Time is the most uncertain wall in the Flores story, because the cave does not preserve a simple calendar. It preserves layers, and layers can be disturbed, mixed, cut, buried, and reinterpreted. For a long time, the most public version of Homo floresiensis was tied to the idea that this small human species may have survived extremely close to the present, near the end of the Ice Age. That idea is powerful because it places another human form almost beside the world that later became ours. But the stronger scientific story is not the one that feels closest or most shocking. It is the one that follows the evidence after it has been tested again. Later research at Liangbua showed that the cave deposits were more complex than first understood. The youngest dates once connected with the fossils were revised, and the known remains of Homo floresiensis are now generally placed deeper in the past than the popular 12,000-year claim suggests. This does not weaken the importance of the species. It makes the story more careful. The question is not whether we can pull Homo floresiensis as close to modern history as possible. The question is how a human branch so different from us could endure on Flores at all, while our own ancestors and relatives were moving through other parts of the world. In human origins, time is not only a number, it is the distance between branches. It tells us which populations may have overlapped, which environments were changing, and which human forms were still present when others were already gone. If the dates are wrong, the whole meaning of contact, survival, and disappearance can change. This is why caution around the timeline matters. A fossil may be found in a cave layer, but the age of that fossil depends on the age of the surrounding deposits and on how those deposits formed. A stone tool may be nearby, but that does not always mean it belongs to the same moment as a bone. Sediment can move. Older material can appear higher. Younger material can enter older spaces. The cave floor is not a book with clean pages. It is a slow accumulation of events. For Homo floresiensis, the revised timeline still leaves a remarkable picture. A small-bodied hominin lived on Flores during the late Pleistocene, in an island world separated by deep water and shaped by its own ecological pressures. That alone is enough to challenge the idea that recent human evolution narrowed quickly toward Homo sapiens. Our species was not always alone, and our body was not the only human body the Earth held, yet we must be honest about what the evidence does not say. It does not prove that Homo floresiensis survived into the final edge of the Ice Age. It does not prove that they watched farming begin elsewhere. It does not prove a hidden population close to recorded memory. Those ideas may feel attractive, but they are not the safest foundation for a truthful story. The safer foundation is still profound. On Flores, another human branch persisted long enough to leave bones, tools, and a serious scientific problem. Its known trace ends before the story becomes easy to connect with our own world. That ending is not a clean death scene. It is a fading edge in the record. When we look at that edge, we are reminded that prehistory is built from absences as much as evidence. A species may continue after its last known fossil, or it may vanish before we find the final trace. The record rarely tells us exactly, so the timeline of Homo floresiensis should be heard not as a dramatic countdown, but as a lesson in humility. Human history did not become simple just because only one human species remains. Beneath our present, there were older layers, missing branches, revised dates, and island silences that still make the question larger than the answer. The timeline of Homo floresiensis teaches a quiet lesson about how easily the past can be misunderstood when a discovery first reaches the world. A strange human species on an island is already difficult to imagine, and when early reports suggested that it might have survived until very close to the present, the story became even more powerful. A number near 12,000 years ago made the species feel almost like a neighbor to the beginning of later human worlds. It placed another human form near a time of rising seas, changing climates, and the slow beginnings of farming in other places. But careful science does not protect the version that feels most astonishing. It protects the version that remains standing after more evidence is examined. At Liangbua, later work showed that the cave deposits were not simple. The layers had been shaped by erosion, missing sediment, older surfaces, and later material. What looked at first like a younger survival could not be held with the same confidence after the cave floor was studied more closely. The known fossils of Homo floresiensis are now usually placed much deeper in the past than the public image of 12,000 years suggests. This correction matters because it shows the difference between a good mystery and a fragile claim. The good mystery remains. A small-bodied human species lived on Flores. It had an unusual body, a small brain case, and a presence tied to stone tools and cave layers. It belonged to the wider human family, yet it did not follow the path that led to us. The fragile claim is the idea that we can confidently place it almost beside recent human memory. That claim should not carry the story. The stronger story is slower and more honest. It asks how an island could hold a human branch apart from the larger human world for so long, and why that branch eventually disappears from the record. This connects directly to the beginning of humanity. Our own species came from a long and branching history, beginning in Africa and spreading through different landscapes. For much of that history, Homo sapiens was not alone. Other human groups existed in other places, with their own bodies and their own local ways of surviving. Flores adds one more form to that wider picture. It reminds us that the human past did not narrow toward us as quickly as our present loneliness makes it seem. But time must be handled gently. The last known evidence of a species is not always the true final day of that species. Fossils are rare. Caves preserve unevenly. Tropical environments can destroy bone. A population may survive after its last known trace, or vanish before the record becomes clear. For Homo floresiensis, The evidence lets us speak of a late prehistoric island population, but it does not allow a clean final scene. We should not imagine their disappearance as a single moment, or pretend we can watch the last generation. The better image is a fading edge. Their traces grow thinner. The island changes. Other animals disappear from the same record. Modern humans may have entered the region. Climate, resources, volcanic activity, and contact may all belong somewhere in the question, but none should be turned into certainty too soon. The revised timeline does not make Homo floresiensis less valuable. It makes the lesson more serious. Truth is not weakened when a dramatic date is corrected. It becomes stronger because it no longer depends on exaggeration. The real wonder is not that another human species almost reached yesterday. The real wonder is that the Earth once held such different human forms at all, and that one small island kept enough of one form for us to realize how incomplete our memory has always been. A revised timeline can feel like a loss when the first version was more dramatic, but in the story of Homo floresiensis, it gives the mystery a firmer shape. If the youngest dates once connected to the fossils are no longer treated as secure, then the question changes. We are no longer asking whether a strange island human almost reached the edge of the modern world. We are asking how an isolated human branch could exist on Flores deep in the late Pleistocene, under conditions so different from the larger human story that its body still feels unexpected to us. That is not a weaker question. It is a better one. It keeps the listener close to what the evidence can support. The past does not become more meaningful when it is pulled artificially nearer to us. It becomes meaningful when we allow its distance to remain real. Homo floresiensis belongs to a time when the world still held several human possibilities, even if their exact overlaps were uneven and difficult to reconstruct. Our own species was spreading through many regions, carrying a different body, a different population history, and eventually a different future. But Flores shows that the future was not obvious from the beginning. On one island, separated by deep water, another human form continued along a path that did not become ours. Time helps us see the loneliness of that path. It was not simply far away in space. It was far away in evolutionary direction. This matters for the wider origin of humanity, because our present makes the past look cleaner than it was. Since Homo sapiens is the only human species left, it is tempting to imagine that all earlier branches were moving toward us or fading quickly before us. Flores makes that picture too narrow. The known evidence may not place Homo floresiensis as late as the old public claim suggested, but it still places them late enough to remind us that human diversity persisted long after the earliest beginnings of our genus. They were not an ancient footnote safely buried near the start of human evolution. They were a later island branch, close enough in the larger scale of time to disturb the idea that humanity had already become one simple thing, yet their final disappearance remains hidden. The record does not show a last day. It does not show the last child, the last tool, or the last group entering the cave. It shows a boundary in evidence. Beyond that boundary, we have possibilities, not certainty. Environmental change may have affected the island. Volcanic activity may have reshaped local habitats. The loss of important animals may have weakened the system. The arrival or expansion of Homo sapiens in the wider region may have mattered. Several pressures may have overlapped. A responsible story must let those possibilities remain separate from proof. This is where the corrected timeline becomes valuable for the listener. It teaches that truth is not the same as the most exciting date. A careful story can still be powerful, because the real loss is deeper than a number. The loss is that an entire human form vanished so completely that only fragments remain to represent it. Bone, stone, sediment, and absence carry the weight of a branch that once lived in its own present. They did not know they would become a question for another species of human. They were simply part of the island's living world. When that world changed, their trace faded. The timeline leaves us with a calm but difficult thought. Human history is not only made of what survived into memory, it is also made of lives that ended before memory could begin, and of branches that remind us how much of being human disappeared before we knew enough to mourn it. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis is one of the places where the story must become most careful. A missing species invites the mind to create a clear ending, because clear endings feel easier to hold. We want to know whether a volcano destroyed them, whether food disappeared, whether modern humans arrived, or whether the island slowly changed until the old way of living could no longer continue. But the evidence does not give one clean cause. It gives a fading record. The fossils and tools show presence. Later layers and absence show silence. Between those two things, the final process remains uncertain. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth. In prehistory, many disappearances are not preserved as events. They are preserved as gaps. A branch of the human family may decline over generations without leaving a dramatic sign. A small population may become smaller, lose contact between groups, struggle through environmental changes, or fail to recover after repeated pressures. On an island, these pressures can become especially serious because there are fewer places to go. Flores had deep water around it, limited land within it, and an ecosystem that had already shaped its animals and hominins in unusual ways. The same isolation that may have helped Homo floresiensis remain distinct also may have made recovery harder when the balance shifted. This brings the question back to human origins. Our own ancestors did not survive because survival was promised to them. They survived through changing conditions, movement, mixture, population size, and chance. Other human groups also survived for long periods, then vanished. Neanderthals disappeared from the record. Denisovans are known mostly through fragmentary evidence and genetic traces. Homo floresiensis left bones and tools on an island. Each case is different, but together they show that being human did not guarantee permanence. For the Flores population, several possible pressures must be held in view without turning any into certainty. Volcanic activity is part of the island's natural history and may have affected habitats. Changes in animals such as stegodons may have affected food relationships. Climate shifts may have altered vegetation, water, and seasonal patterns. The arrival of Homo sapiens in the wider region may have changed the human landscape. These possibilities are serious, but the record does not let us choose one simple ending. A careful script should not say they were killed by one event unless the evidence clearly supports it. It should say that their disappearance likely belonged to a complex set of changes that we can only partly see. This is a colder truth than a dramatic ending, because it suggests that extinction can be quiet. A human branch does not need to fall in a single catastrophe to be lost. It can vanish through narrowing options, fewer births, less food, smaller groups, more fragile connections, a changed forest, a missing animal, a new pressure at the edge of the known world. Over time, the record stops. For a species already confined to an island, the margin between endurance and disappearance may have been thin. The mystery of Homo floresiensis is therefore not only why they vanished, it is how long they continued before vanishing, and how much of their life left no mark that could survive. When we look at the absence after the last evidence, we are not looking at emptiness. We are looking at the limit of what archaeology can return to us. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis reminds us that human history contains losses that cannot be fully narrated. The island kept enough to prove they were real, but not enough to tell us how the last thread broke. That is why their ending should remain open, quiet, and unresolved. A small population can disappear without leaving a dramatic wound in the ground. This is one of the hardest truths to accept about Homo floresiensis, because the mind keeps searching for a visible ending. We imagine fire, ash, conflict, famine, or one final disaster. Yet many extinctions do not happen as one clear moment. They happen as a slow loss of recovery. A group becomes smaller. The distance between families becomes harder to bridge. A few bad seasons carry more weight. A familiar food source becomes less reliable. A useful animal declines. A cave that once held repeated traces becomes quiet. On Flores, this kind of fragility would have mattered because the island was not endless. A population living inside a limited space cannot always solve pressure by moving far away. The sea around Flores was not just scenery, it was the outer wall of every option. For Homo floresiensis, that wall may have helped preserve difference for a long time, but it also meant that a shrinking world could not easily be escaped. This connects to the wider beginning of the human story, because early human survival was always tied to population size as much as anatomy. A species does not continue because one body is well adapted. It continues because enough bodies live, reproduce, and keep knowledge moving across generations. Small groups can be resilient for a time, especially when they know a place deeply, but small groups can also be vulnerable to chance. The loss of a few individuals can matter. Reduced contact between groups can matter. A change in the number of children who survive can matter. These are not dramatic details, but they are powerful over time. In a large population spread across wide land, local loss may be absorbed elsewhere. In an island population, the same loss can echo more strongly. This does not mean we know the exact population structure of Homo floresiensis. We do not. The fossils do not give a census. The tools do not show how many groups existed. The cave does not tell us whether they were numerous, scattered, or already rare near the end of their known record. But the logic of island life allows a cautious point. Isolation can make population history more fragile. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis may therefore have involved not only outside events, but also the inner weakness that comes when a small population has fewer ways to absorb change. Environmental pressures could have pressed on that weakness. Volcanic activity may have altered habitats. Shifts in rainfall or vegetation may have changed the pattern of food. The decline or disappearance of important island animals may have affected survival. Contact with modern humans, if it occurred in a meaningful way, may have added another pressure. None of these possibilities should be turned into a single answer too quickly. The evidence is not strong enough for that. The more honest picture is a set of pressures gathering around a population with limited room to respond. This is a quieter ending than a sudden catastrophe, but it is also more believable. Human history contains many endings that were not seen by anyone who could record them. Branches vanished before writing, before memory, before names. Homo floresiensis belongs to that older silence. Their final generations, if we could see them, might not look like a great event. They might look like ordinary life becoming harder to continue. Fewer traces in the ground, fewer tools left behind, fewer bones preserved. Then nothing that survives for us. This is why the island story feels so heavy, even when told softly. Flores did not only shape a strange human form, it may also have narrowed the path by which that form could recover from change. The same boundary that made their story possible may have helped make its ending invisible. The final disappearance of Homo floresiensis should be understood as a boundary in evidence, not as a scene we are allowed to watch. A scene would be easier. It would give us a last day, a last cave entrance, a last group moving through the forest, or one visible disaster that explains why this island human branch no longer appears in the record. But the past rarely offers endings in that form. What we have on Flores is more restrained. Before a certain point, bones, tools, animal remains, and cave layers show that another human form lived in this island world. After that point, the record becomes quiet. That silence is powerful, but it is not the same as a complete explanation. A species may survive beyond its last known fossil because fossils are rare and preservation is uneven. A species may also vanish before the ground gives us a clear sign. This is why the ending of Homo floresiensis has to remain open. Environmental change may have mattered. Volcanic disturbance may have altered habitats. Important island animals may have declined. Population size may have become too small to recover from pressure. The arrival or expansion of Homo sapiens in the wider region may have introduced new competition, new contact, or new disruption. Several of these forces may have overlapped, and none should be turned into a single certain answer. The island itself makes this uncertainty more serious. Flores was not a wide continent where a struggling population could easily follow resources into another region. It was a bounded world surrounded by deep water, shaped by volcanic landscapes, caves, forests, animals, and limited space. The same separation that may have helped preserve the distinct body of Homo floresiensis could also have reduced their options when conditions changed. A small population can live in balance with a place for many generations, but that balance can be narrow. If a familiar food source becomes less reliable, the effect may spread through daily survival. If a key animal disappears, the relationship between tools, movement, and food may change. If rainfall patterns shift, a known landscape can become less predictable. If volcanic activity covers or damages parts of the environment, the island does not offer endless alternatives. These possibilities do not create a final certainty, but they help us understand why disappearance on an island can be slow, quiet, and difficult to read. This returns us to the deeper beginning of humanity. Our own ancestors did not survive because they were promised a future. They survived through population size, movement, mixture, flexibility, and chance, all inside changing environments. Other human branches also survived for long periods, but their futures ended. Neanderthals disappeared from the record. Denisovans are known through fragmentary remains and genetic traces. Homo floresiensis left a different kind of message. Bones and tools in an island cave, enough to show that another human form existed, but not enough to tell us how the last thread broke. Their disappearance reminds us that human history is not only the story of what continued, it is also the story of what almost vanished without being seen at all. A whole way of being human can fall below the level of preservation. Fewer individuals leave fewer bones. Fewer visits to a cave leave fewer tools. A shrinking population may leave no dramatic mark, only less and less evidence until the ground no longer speaks. That is the cold truth behind the Flores mystery. Their end may not have looked like a great event to those living through it. It may have looked like ordinary life becoming harder to continue. Fewer resources, fewer successful births, fewer safe places, fewer chances for a small population to absorb change. We should not imagine them as lesser humans because they disappeared, and we should not imagine ourselves as the inevitable answer because we survived. Homo floresiensis was one island answer to the problem of being human. That answer endured long enough to become real in bone and stone, then faded from the record without giving us a final sentence. What remains is not a solved ending, but a quiet question about how many other human forms disappeared in the same way. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a silence too thin for history to hold. When Homo sapiens enters the Flores story, the air around the question changes. Until then, Homo floresiensis can be imagined mainly as an island branch, shaped by separation, living within its own narrow world. But our species brings another kind of pressure into the picture, not because we can prove a simple confrontation, but because the wider region was changing as modern humans expanded through Southeast Asia and beyond. The safest way to tell this is not to claim that Homo sapiens directly caused the disappearance of Homo floresiensis. The evidence does not allow that as a settled conclusion. The safer point is that by the time modern humans were moving through nearby regions, the human world was no longer made of isolated branches alone. Populations were shifting. Coastlines were changing. Sea levels rose and fell. Animals moved or disappeared. New kinds of contact may have become possible in places where older worlds had remained separate for a long time. In that wider movement, Flores becomes a place where two different meanings of being human nearly touch, even if the exact nature of their overlap remains uncertain. Homo sapiens carried a body and a population history different from the one preserved at Liangbua. Our species had larger social networks in many settings, broader movement across landscapes, and eventually a capacity for rapid cultural change that left stronger traces in some regions. But this should not be turned into a simple story of superior humans replacing inferior ones. That old ladder is too crude for the evidence. Homo floresiensis had already endured on Flores under conditions that were not ours. Their survival had its own logic. If Homo sapiens became part of the final pressure on the island, it would have happened inside a larger ecological and demographic setting, not as a clean scene of victory. This matters because the origin of Homo sapiens was also fragile in the beginning. Our branch began in Africa as one population history among others, not as the guaranteed owner of the future. We spread because conditions, movement, cooperation, adaptation, and chance allowed us to spread. Other human forms did not disappear because they were simply mistakes. They disappeared because the conditions that had supported them changed, narrowed, or were overwhelmed. On Flores, a small island population would have been especially sensitive to new pressures. If modern humans arrived nearby or on the island itself, even small changes could have mattered. New competition for resources, new hunting patterns, new diseases, new disturbances to animal populations, or simple demographic pressure could have changed the balance. Each of these remains a possibility rather than a proven answer. Still, Thinking about Homo sapiens in this story is necessary because it reminds us that the end of other human forms did not happen in an empty world. Our survival is connected to their disappearance, even when the exact connection is hard to trace. There is a quiet discomfort in that thought. We are the species asking the question, but we may also belong to the set of pressures that help make the question possible. Without Homo sapiens surviving, there would be no one to name Homo floresiensis, no one to measure the bones, no one to wonder why the island branch vanished. Yet because Homo sapiens survived, the story is always told from our side of the silence. That is why caution is not only scientific, it is ethical. We should not make ourselves heroes in a story where other human branches disappeared. We should not make Homo floresiensis helpless shadows waiting to be replaced. The better view is quieter. Two human histories move through the same broad world, one expanding through many landscapes, one held inside an island. Their relationship, if it happened directly, is still partly hidden. What remains visible is the result. Only one human species continued into the present, and the other became a fossil question. Flores asks us to hold that result without pride. It asks us to notice that our survival made the human family smaller, not because we intended that loss in any simple way, but because history often preserves one branch by letting the others fall beyond memory. The possible meeting between Homo sapiens and Homo floresiensis is one of the most tempting questions in this story, and also one of the most dangerous to answer too strongly. The mind wants contact. It wants two human forms standing in the same landscape, seeing one another across a riverbed or near the mouth of a cave. But the evidence does not allow that scene to be drawn with confidence. What can be said more safely is that modern humans were expanding through the wider region during the later Pleistocene, and Flores was not outside the changing human world forever. Whether Homo sapiens directly encountered Homo floresiensis, whether the two populations overlapped on the island, or whether the smaller island branch had already disappeared before meaningful contact occurred remains uncertain. That uncertainty should stay visible. It protects the story from becoming fantasy. Still, the possibility of contact matters because it changes how we think about human uniqueness. If two human forms lived near the same broad region, then humanity was not a single voice. It was a set of nearby presences, each shaped by different histories. Homo sapiens carried one path: larger populations in many places, wide movement, growing cultural flexibility, and eventually strong signs of symbolic and technological variety. Homo floresiensis carried another path: a small body, an island setting, long separation, and a form of survival fitted to Flores. If they ever came close, that closeness would not have been a meeting between progress and failure. It would have been a meeting between different evolutionary histories. This distinction is important because the beginning of our own species was not a crown placed on the human family. Homo sapiens emerged from older African populations through a long process of biological and behavioral change. Our ancestors were part of nature, subject to climate, food, danger, childbirth, migration, and chance. They were not destined from the beginning to become the only human species left. Their later success can make them seem inevitable, but inevitability is an illusion created after survival has already happened. On Flores, that illusion becomes weaker. The existence of Homo floresiensis shows that another human branch could persist far away from the main landscapes of our own expansion. If Homo sapiens eventually entered the island world, the balance there may have changed even without direct violence. A new human population can change an ecosystem by hunting, gathering, moving animals, competing for shelter, altering fire patterns, or simply increasing pressure on limited resources. These are possible effects, not proven causes. A small island does not need a large disturbance to become unstable. A new presence may matter because the system is already narrow. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis, if it happened near a time of wider modern human movement, may therefore belong to a complex meeting of population pressure and environmental change. But the story should not become a trial where Homo sapiens is declared guilty without enough evidence. It should become a mirror. We are looking at a lost human branch from the side of the branch that remained. That position gives us knowledge, but it also gives us bias. We naturally ask why they did not become like us, why their tools did not become more complex, why their bodies stayed small, why their record ended. These questions quietly place us at the center. Flores asks for a different posture. Instead of asking why they failed to reach our path, we can ask how their path made sense where it existed. Instead of imagining contact as conquest, we can imagine it as pressure inside a fragile world. Instead of treating disappearance as proof of inferiority, we can treat it as evidence that survival is never guaranteed to any human form. In that way, Homo sapiens enters the story not as the hero, but as a reminder of how narrow the present has become. Once, the Earth held more than one kind of human. Now it does not. Whatever happened on Flores, that loss should make the surviving species quieter, not prouder. If Homo sapiens belongs in the story of Homo floresiensis, it is not because we can place our species at the center of every answer. It is because our arrival in the wider region changed the human landscape in which older branches had once existed. A world with several human forms is different from a world with one. In the older world, different populations could remain separated by geography, climate, distance, and chance. A branch on an island could continue along its own path while other humans lived far away. But as Homo sapiens spread through more environments, the number of untouched human worlds likely became smaller. This does not prove a direct encounter on Flores, and it does not prove a violent ending. It only shows that the context around Homo floresiensis was not frozen. The wider human world was moving. Coastlines were changing, animals were shifting, populations were expanding. A small island branch, already living inside limits, may have had fewer ways to absorb any new pressure. This is the careful place where Homo sapiens should stand in the narrative, not as a guaranteed cause, but as part of a changing background that may have mattered. The beginning of our own species was also part of that same uncertainty. Homo sapiens did not begin as the obvious final human form. Our ancestors emerged from earlier African populations, adapted to different environments, and survived through a mixture of biology, culture, cooperation, movement, and chance. Later, because our branch continued and the others disappeared, we inherited the right to tell the story. That inheritance can be misleading. It makes our body feel normal, our brain feel expected, and our spread across the planet feel like the direction evolution was always taking. Flores interrupts that feeling. It shows another human form that did not follow our road, yet was real enough to endure on its own island. If our species ever entered its world, the meeting would not have been a simple collision between the future and the past. It would have been two living histories touching under conditions we still cannot fully reconstruct. One history was broadening across regions. The other was narrowed by water, small population size, and island ecology. In such a setting, even indirect effects could matter. Modern humans may have changed animal populations. They may have competed for resources. They may have brought new behaviors into a fragile ecosystem, or Homo floresiensis may already have been gone before any meaningful contact. The evidence does not let us decide with confidence. A truthful account must hold the possibilities without pretending one has become proven. This restraint gives the story its deeper weight. We are not looking at a defeated enemy, or at a lesser people, or at a hidden remnant of myth. We are looking at a human branch whose ending sits near the edge of what evidence can say. Homo sapiens appears in that edge not only as a possible pressure, but as the survivor who later looks back. That role should make the telling more humble. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis is part of the same larger process by which the human family became smaller. Neanderthals vanished. Denisovans became known to us mostly through fragments and traces. Other older forms disappeared earlier. Flores preserved one island branch just long enough for us to see that the present is not the full measure of the past. This is why the role of Homo sapiens should not be turned into pride. If our expansion helped narrow the human world, even indirectly, then our survival carries a shadow. We are here, but being here means we live after the loss of every other human form. The question is not whether Homo sapiens won. That word is too small for a story shaped by climate, distance, ecology, population, contact, and chance. The better question is what kind of memory a surviving species owes to the branches that did not survive. On Flores, the answer begins with restraint. We do not invent their thoughts. We do not force a final cause. We do not make ourselves the hero of their silence. We simply recognize that another way of being human once lived on an island, and that our own presence in the world may be inseparable from the disappearance of such ways. What makes Homo floresiensis so unsettling is that the species changes the meaning of the word human without asking for permission. We are used to thinking of humanity through ourselves. A human body is tall enough to look familiar. A human skull is shaped like ours. A human future leads toward language, art, agriculture, cities, and memory. But Flores breaks that habit. It presents a human branch that does not move toward the world we know. It does not leave behind writing, monuments, large settlements, or a clear line into living people. It leaves a smaller body, a smaller brain case, stone tools, cave layers, animal remains, and a difficult island. From that evidence, one lesson becomes clear. Being human was once broader than the form that survived. This is not a poetic idea. It is a biological and historical one. The human family was not a single narrow road. It was a branching pattern, with different populations living in different places under different pressures. Homo sapiens is the only branch alive today, so our minds naturally pull the whole past toward us. We make ourselves the center. We imagine other human forms as steps leading to our arrival, or as side examples that failed to become what we became. Homo floresiensis makes that view harder to defend. Their body was not a step toward ours. Their island world was not a rehearsal for our future. Their survival was its own answer to the problem of life in a small, separated place. This matters because the beginning of humanity was never a guarantee of one final shape. Early members of the human lineage emerged in Africa, changed across time, and spread into new environments. Some populations adapted to cold regions. Some lived across broad landscapes. Some mixed with others. Some remained isolated. Some left only bones. Some left genetic traces. Some left almost nothing. Flores shows one of the strangest preserved outcomes of that branching process. But strange does not mean unreal, and it does not mean lesser. It means the present has trained us to expect too little from the past. When we look at Homo floresiensis carefully, we are not looking at a failed version of Homo sapiens. We are looking at a different form of human survival, one shaped by island limits, small population size, possible long isolation, and an ecosystem that did not match the open continental settings where many human stories are usually told. Their existence also changes how we think about progress. If evolution were a ladder, then small bodies and small brains would always belong lower down. But evolution is not a ladder. It is a process of fit, chance, inheritance, and change. A body does not need to satisfy later human expectations. It only has to work well enough in the world where it lives. On Flores, a human form with unusual anatomy endured long enough to leave traces that later people could study. That endurance should make us cautious. It suggests that the human past cannot be measured only by size, complexity, expansion, or resemblance to us. A tool does not need to become more elaborate if a simpler form continues to serve. A population does not need to expand across continents to be successful for many generations. A species does not need to survive into the present to have been a real and meaningful part of human history. This is the deeper disturbance of Flores. It removes the comfort of thinking that humanity naturally narrowed toward our body, our brain, and our way of living. Instead, it shows that many human possibilities once existed, and that most of them ended before they could be remembered. Homo floresiensis widens the word human, but it widens it through absence. We know them because they are gone. We understand their importance because they did not continue. The cave gives enough evidence to disturb certainty, but not enough to close the mystery. That is why their story belongs so well to the quiet history before sleep. It does not demand excitement. It asks for humility. It asks us to imagine that the human family was once wider, stranger, and more fragile than the lonely present suggests. To widen the word human is not to make the past vague. It is to make the past more exact. Homo floresiensis matters because it forces us to stop using ourselves as the only scale. A human species can be known from bones and tools, yet still remain far outside the picture people carry in their minds. It can have a small body, an unusual skull, a different pattern of limbs, and still belong to the same wide evolutionary family that eventually produced us. This is difficult because modern humans are surrounded by our own evidence. We have filled the earth with language, buildings, roads, images, machines, and written memory. It becomes easy to think that the human story was always moving towards such things. Flores interrupts that comfort. It gives us a human branch that did not leave a world of monuments, but left enough to prove that human life once existed in a quieter and stranger form. The evidence is modest, but its meaning is large. A few fossils in a cave can change the shape of the whole family tree. A small stone tool can remind us that survival is not measured by spectacle. A body that seems unfamiliar can show that evolution did not have one preferred human outline. This is where the beginning of our own species must be remembered carefully. Homo sapiens emerged from older African populations within a long and branching process. We were not born outside that process. We were part of it. Our ancestors carried inherited bodies, faced changing climates, moved through landscapes, and lived among other forms of life. Other human branches did the same in other places. Some were close relatives, some were more distant. Some may have met and mixed, some remained apart. Homo floresiensis appears to belong to one of the most unusual forms of that wider pattern. A small island population, separated by water, shaped by long limits, and preserved only through fragments. If we call them human, we must allow the word to include more than familiarity. We must let it include difference, without turning difference into inferiority. This is an important correction because the surviving species often writes the definition. Since Homo sapiens is still here, the human body now looks like our body. Human intelligence now looks like our intelligence. Human success now looks like our spread across the planet. But those definitions are shaped by survival, not by inevitability. If Homo floresiensis had survived and we had vanished, the normal human body in their memory might have looked very different. Our size, our restlessness, and our later history might have seemed strange. This reversal is not a fantasy about their thoughts. It is a way to see our own bias. We judge the past from the body that remains. Flores asks us to loosen that judgment. A small brain case does not erase human significance. A small island does not erase history. A missing future does not mean a branch had no value while it lived. In evolution, value is not decided by who tells the story later. It is decided, moment by moment, by whether a population can continue under the conditions around it. Homo floresiensis continued long enough for the island to become part of human memory. That is enough to matter. Their existence also shows that difference can survive in places where isolation protects it. A continent may absorb small populations through movement and mixture. An island may hold them apart. This can preserve unusual forms, but it can also make them vulnerable when conditions change. The same boundary that widens our view of humanity also reminds us how easily a branch can disappear. So the meaning of Homo floresiensis is not that they were bizarre for the sake of being bizarre. It is that our idea of normal was too small. The human family once included bodies, histories, and island lives that did not lead to us. Some of them ended in silence. Some left only traces. Flores gives one of those traces back to us, and asks whether we can look at another human form without forcing it to become either a monster, a failure, or a mirror. The deeper meaning of Homo floresiensis is that humanity was never as narrow as the present makes it appear. Today, every living human belongs to one species, and that fact quietly shapes the way we imagine the past. We look backward from a lonely position. We see our bodies, our brains, our tools, our migrations, and our later societies. Then we begin to treat them as if they were the expected result of evolution. Flores makes that expectation less certain. It shows a human branch that did not become us, did not leave descendants we can clearly follow, and did not build the kind of record that later history usually rewards. Yet it lived. It endured in an island world, shaped by water, stone, animals, cave floors, volcanic ground, and limits that repeated across generations. This is why the species matters beyond its size. The small body and small brain case are not only biological details. They are reminders that evolution does not move toward the form that survives to describe it. It moves through local conditions. It follows resources, barriers, accidents, inheritance, and fragile continuities. A population can be well fitted to a small world and still disappear when that world changes. A species can be real for a long time and still leave behind only a few fragments. A human form can be deeply different from us and still belong within the wider story of human origins. That wider story began far from Flores, in Africa, where older human populations emerged and changed across immense time. From that beginning, the human family spread into many directions. Some groups lived across open landscapes, some entered colder regions, some remained in forests or mixed habitats, some crossed into islands. Each place changed the question being asked of the body. Flores asked one of the strangest questions. What happens when a human population becomes enclosed by water and time? Homo floresiensis is one answer, though not a complete one. We cannot know their full daily life. We cannot know their inner world. We cannot give them thoughts, fears, names, or meanings that the evidence cannot support. But we can understand the scale of what their bones reveal. They show that another human way of being existed outside the road that led to modern people. They show that the human family tree was not a clean trunk rising toward Homo sapiens, but a branching form with limbs that grew, separated, and ended. This changes the emotional weight of their disappearance. If Homo floresiensis were only a curiosity, then their end would be a footnote. But if they were one of several human possibilities, then their disappearance becomes part of a larger loss. The Earth once held more than one kind of human, and now it does not. That fact should not create pride in the surviving species. It should create humility. We are not the final proof that evolution had a plan. We are the branch that remained after many other branches fell beyond memory. Flores allows one of those lost branches to return briefly, not as a complete portrait, but as a question made of bone and stone. It asks whether we can recognize human difference without reducing it to failure. It asks whether survival should be measured only by reaching the present. It asks whether our own form feels normal only because every other human form is gone. In the quiet of that question, Homo floresiensis becomes more than a strange island species. It becomes a mirror held at a distance, showing that the human past was wider than the human present, and that the word human once had more shapes than we can now easily imagine. The island survival of Homo floresiensis also changes how we think about loss. In ordinary history, loss is often connected to written memory. A city burns, a language fades, a people leaves records of displacement, conflict, or decline. But deep prehistory is different. Most losses happened before anyone could write them down, before names could be preserved, before a voice could cross time. A human branch could vanish completely, and the earth would not pause. Rain would fall on the same slopes. Forests would return, animals would move through the same ground, sediment would cover the cave floor. The disappearance would become almost invisible unless bone, stone, or ash happened to remain in the right place. Homo floresiensis belongs to this older kind of loss. They did not leave a history of themselves. They left a trace that another human species found much later. That fact gives their story a quiet weight. We are not only looking at an unusual body from Flores, we are looking at how fragile human memory is when it depends on chance preservation. The beginning of the human story was full of branches, but most branches did not leave a clear path to the present. Some ended in climates that destroyed evidence, some lived in places where bone rarely survives, some may be known only through a tooth, a fragment, a tool, or genetic traces in later people. Flores is remarkable because it gave us enough to recognize a different human form, but even there, the record is incomplete. We do not know how many individuals lived across the island. We do not know how long their last communities persisted after the final evidence we have. We do not know whether their ending was fast, slow, local, or uneven. The loss is real, but the shape of the loss remains partly hidden. This is important because Homo sapiens often treats memory as if it belongs naturally to us. We remember through stories, monuments, books, museums, and science. Yet for most of our own deep past, even our ancestors left only fragments. If our branch had vanished before writing, we too might have been reduced to bones in sediment, a few stone tools, and arguments among later researchers. Homo floresiensis reminds us that the difference between remembered and forgotten is not always importance. Sometimes it is preservation, sometimes it is luck, sometimes it is the chemistry of soil, the stillness of a cave, the angle of burial, or the survival of one small bone. That thought makes the island story more serious. A whole human way of living can disappear, not because it was meaningless, but because the world has no duty to keep evidence for us. The educational value of this is simple and deep. We should not confuse absence with emptiness. Where the record is silent, life may once have been dense, repeated, and meaningful in ways we cannot now reconstruct. On Flores, the cave speaks only in fragments, yet those fragments are enough to challenge the loneliness of the present. They tell us that the human family was once more varied than one surviving species suggests. They tell us that extinction is not only the death of bodies, but the shrinking of possible memories. When Homo floresiensis disappeared from the record, one form of human experience became unreachable. Its daily rhythms, its learned paths, its use of stone, its relationship with animals and weather, its generations of children and elders, all passed beyond direct knowing. We can respect that boundary without filling it with invention. In fact, respect begins there. The lost branch does not need our fantasy to become valuable. It is valuable because it was real, because it survived in a difficult island world, and because its absence now teaches us how much of humanity existed before memory could hold it. To understand the loss of Homo floresiensis, we have to think about how little of any life becomes evidence. Most of what a living population does is made from materials that do not last. Footsteps fade. Skin, hair, wood, leaves, fibers, and voices disappear. A shelter may collapse into soil. A path through vegetation may close after one season. A skill may pass from older hands to younger hands for thousands of years and still leave no clear mark if the material was perishable. Even stone tools, which survive better than most things, tell only a thin story. They show that stone was struck and used, but not the full life around that action. The same is true of bones. A skull can carry anatomy, but not memory. A limb bone can show form, but not a lifetime of movement. This is why the Flores record must be treated with patience. It gives us enough to know that another human branch existed, yet it also reminds us that almost everything about that branch has been lost. That lost portion is not empty, it is simply unreachable. This matters because human origins are often told through the evidence that survived, as if the surviving evidence were the same as the whole past. It is not. The human family began in deep time, with populations living, separating, adapting, and disappearing across landscapes that were never designed to preserve them. Africa holds the deeper beginning of our own lineage, but even there the record is incomplete. Beyond Africa, the record becomes even more uneven. Some regions preserve caves, some preserve open-air sites, some preserve DNA, some preserve almost nothing. Tropical islands can be especially difficult, because heat, moisture, erosion, and changing sediments can erase organic remains. Flores is therefore remarkable not because it gives a complete story, but because it gives any story at all. The fact that Liangbua preserved enough to recognize Homo floresiensis should make us wonder how many other human forms may have passed through the world without leaving evidence strong enough to reach us. This is not an invitation to invent species without proof. It is a reminder that the known record is a surviving fraction. Science must stay with evidence, but human humility should remember that evidence is never the whole of life. For Homo floresiensis, this gap between life and evidence is especially important. The island may have held many generations that left no preserved bones. It may have held movements across landscapes that left no visible tracks. It may have held knowledge of animals, water sources, stone places, and seasonal change that cannot be read directly from the cave floor. We cannot give them names, stories, beliefs, or emotions. That would cross the line, but we can say that any human population surviving across generations must have had repeated ways of meeting its world. Children had to grow, food had to be found, bodies had to recover from hunger, injury, weather, and age. Knowledge had to continue somehow, Even if the form of that knowledge is hidden from us, the absence of detail should not make the population feel less real. It should make the loss feel larger. A fossil is not the life. It is what remains after nearly everything else has vanished. This is where the lesson becomes valuable for the listener. Homo floresiensis teaches that the past should not be judged only by what it managed to preserve for us. A quiet life in a cave, a tool made for an ordinary task, a small body moving through forest and volcanic ground, a generation that left no bone at all of these may have mattered in their own time, even if they left no durable record. The modern world often values what can be seen, counted, displayed, and remembered. Deep prehistory gives another lesson. Most real lives disappear without display. Their value is not reduced by that disappearance. On Flores, another human form lived inside a narrow island world, and when it vanished, it took with it an entire way of belonging to the earth. The fragments that remain do not let us recover that world fully, but they do ask us to listen more carefully to silence. The loss of Homo floresiensis is not only the loss of a species, it is the loss of a possible human memory. This is difficult to feel at first, because the evidence is so small compared with the life it represents. A skull fragment, a jaw, teeth, limb bones, stone tools, animal remains, and cave layers can seem like objects from a distant scientific problem. But each object points towards something larger that cannot be fully returned. Behind the bones there were generations. Behind the tools there were repeated gestures. Behind the cave layers there were seasons, shelters, dangers, recoveries, and ordinary continuities that did not survive in a form we can read. This is why the story should not be told as if the fossils are the whole species. They are only the small portion that time failed to erase. The true life of Homo floresiensis was mostly made of things that disappear: breath, movement, hunger, attention, sleep, injury, learning, and the slow passing of knowledge between bodies. None of this gives us permission to invent their thoughts or fill the silence with imagined scenes. It gives us a reason to be careful with the silence. The human story began long before writing, long before cities, and long before anyone could name a species or preserve a memory on purpose. Early human populations emerged in Africa, then some branches moved into other regions, carrying bodies into new climates and new landscapes. Most of that immense process is known only through fragments. We are used to thinking of Homo sapiens as the species of memory because we have language, records, images, and museums. Yet our own deep past would also be nearly silent without bone and stone. If our branch had vanished before written history, later beings might know us only as another incomplete question. Homo floresiensis makes that thought quiet and sharp. It shows that importance and preservation are not the same thing. A life can be important in its own world and still leave almost nothing for another age. A population can endure for thousands of generations and still be represented later by a few remains from one island. Flores preserved enough to widen the meaning of humanity, but not enough to restore the human world that disappeared there. This incomplete preservation should shape the emotional tone of the story. It should prevent pride, and it should prevent fantasy. We should not treat Homo floresiensis as a myth made for wonder, or as a lesser version of ourselves made for comparison. They were a real human branch, known through limited evidence, living in a specific island ecology. Their value does not depend on whether they became us, whether they survived close to the present, or whether they left signs that look impressive to modern eyes. Their value lies in the fact that they were one of the ways human life once belonged to the earth. When that way ended, the human family became smaller. Not only biologically smaller, but imaginatively smaller. The present now contains only one living human form, and that makes it easy to forget how wide the past once was. The cave at Liangbua gives back a little of that width, but only a little. It allows us to say that another human form lived on Flores. It does not allow us to hear their voices, know their names, or understand the full pattern of their days. That boundary is part of the lesson. A truthful story does not need to cross it. The quiet educational message is that absence must be respected. In prehistory, absence often means that evidence has failed, not that life was empty. The missing details around Homo floresiensis are not blank spaces to decorate. They are reminders that most of humanity's deep past is beyond recovery. What remains should make us more humble about our place in time. We are not standing at the top of a completed story. We are standing after many losses, holding a few fragments from branches that did not continue. On Flores, one of those branches left enough for us to know it was real, and not enough for us to close the question. That may be the most honest memory we can offer. Another human life once existed there, and its silence is part of what the human story has become. By this point, the story of Homo floresiensis has become less about strangeness and more about perspective. At first, the title pulls the mind toward the unusual. A small human species, an island, a late prehistoric survival, a body that does not fit the familiar image of humanity. But if we stay with the evidence long enough, the center of the story slowly changes. The most important question is not why they seem strange to us. The more important question is why we ever expected the human past to look familiar. Homo sapiens now stands alone, and that loneliness has shaped our imagination. We look back from one surviving body, one surviving species, one surviving branch, and we quietly turn that branch into the measure of everything before it. Flores weakens that habit. It shows that another human form once lived in a real island world, using stone, moving through volcanic landscapes, sharing an ecosystem with extinct animals, and enduring under limits that did not lead into our future. This is a lesson in perspective, because the human story did not begin with us already waiting at the end. It began in Africa, with older populations, changing bodies, shifting climates, and branching possibilities. Some branches moved far, some remained local, some mixed, some disappeared. Some were preserved in caves. Some left only fragments too small to explain them fully. Homo floresiensis belongs to that wider pattern. Their existence reminds us that survival is not the same as progress toward a single form. It is a relationship between a population and its conditions. On Flores, those conditions were shaped by water, limited land, island animals, ecological balance, and long separation. A small body may have made sense there. A simple stone tool may have been enough there. A narrow world may have allowed continuity there. None of this makes them lesser. It makes them local, as all life is local before history turns it into a story. The educational value for the listener is quiet but important. We should be careful when a title says weird, strange, primitive, advanced, or failed. These words often reveal more about our expectations than about the past itself. Homo floresiensis was weird only if Homo sapiens is treated as the normal destination of evolution. But evolution has no destination that it must reach. It does not work toward the species that later studies the fossils. It works through survival, reproduction, separation, adaptation, chance, and loss. When the Flores branch disappeared, it did not prove that our branch was morally higher or naturally chosen. It proved only that different human forms faced different histories, and that one of those histories ended. This is why the story should not finish with shock. It should move toward humility. We are the surviving human species, but we are also the species living after a great narrowing. The Earth once held more human variety than it holds now. The cave at Liangbua returns a small piece of that variety, not enough to rebuild a world, but enough to unsettle the comfort of a single-line story. In that sense, Homo floresiensis is not only a fossil discovery. It is a reminder that the present is not the full shape of humanity. It is only what remains visible after time, extinction, erosion, and chance have taken almost everything else away. When we listen to the island carefully, the question becomes calmer and deeper. It is not simply, how could such a human species survive on Flores? It is how many forms of being human once survived in places we have not yet learned how to remember. The lesson of Homo floresiensis is not that the past was filled with monsters, or that every strange fossil should become a mystery beyond science. The lesson is almost the opposite. The past becomes deeper when we stay close to what can be known. A small human body on Flores is already enough to widen the story. A revised timeline is already enough to teach caution. A cave floor with bones, tools, animal remains, and difficult layers is already enough to remind us that human history was never a simple march toward the present. We do not need to add certainty where evidence is incomplete. We do not need to turn island life into legend. We do not need to give Homo floresiensis thoughts, fears, names, or final scenes that cannot be supported. Their real value lies in the way they make our own assumptions visible. We assume that larger brains, taller bodies, wider expansion, and more complex technology were the natural direction of being human. Flores shows that a human branch could endure differently. It could be small, it could be isolated, it could live within a narrow ecosystem. It could leave modest tools rather than dramatic inventions. It could matter deeply without becoming the ancestor of the world we know. This is a useful lesson because modern life often teaches people to mistake scale for value. Bigger looks better. Faster looks better. More visible looks more important. But deep time does not always agree. A species can survive for a long time without becoming dominant. A population can know its own landscape closely without spreading across continents. A tool can be plain and still serve its purpose. A body can be unfamiliar and still be complete within its own evolutionary path. Homo floresiensis helps us see that survival is not always a story of expansion. Sometimes survival is a story of fit. The body fits a place. The habits fit the available materials. The population fits a rhythm of food, water, shelter, and risk. On Flores, that fit may have lasted across many generations, even though it eventually ended. This connects again to the origin of humanity. Our own branch also began as a local form of life, not as a guaranteed future. Homo sapiens emerged within changing African environments, then spread through many regions through movement, cooperation, adaptation, and chance. Only afterward did our survival make our path seem obvious. But if we look backward honestly, our species was also vulnerable. Our ancestors also depended on climate, food, births, and fragile continuity. The difference is that our branch continued while others did not. Homo floresiensis asks us to hold that difference without pride. Their disappearance does not make them meaningless. Our survival does not make us inevitable. Both belong to a larger pattern in which life continues only when conditions allow it. The story also teaches a careful way to listen to science. Scientific knowledge changes when evidence is re-examined. The younger date once associated with the Flores fossils was revised, and that revision did not destroy the discovery. It made the discovery more reliable. This is important for a truthful history channel, because trust is built not by choosing the most dramatic version, but by showing why careful evidence matters. A claim can be exciting and still be weak. A corrected claim can be less sensational and still be far more meaningful. Homo floresiensis remains extraordinary even without forcing the title into an absolute conclusion. They remain extraordinary because they show that the human family was once wider than we are. They remain extraordinary because their island life reveals a path of survival that did not point toward us. They remain extraordinary because their silence is real. In the end, Flores teaches that humanity should not be understood only through the branch that survived. It should also be understood through the branches that ended, the forms that vanished, and the traces that ask us to be honest about how incomplete our memory is. The quiet value of Homo floresiensis is that the species teaches us how to live with an unfinished answer. Many stories about human origins try to end with certainty. They want a clear ancestor, a clear cause, a clear disappearance, and a clear moral lesson. Flores does not give that kind of comfort. It gives a small body, an island, a cave, stone tools, animal remains, revised dates, and a silence that begins where the evidence ends. Yet that unfinished quality is not a failure of the story. It is the story. Deep history is not a complete memory waiting to be opened. It is a broken record that must be handled with care. Homo floresiensis reminds us that the past should not be made louder than the evidence allows. If we make it too loud, we lose the truth that made it valuable in the first place. The island branch matters because it was real, not because it can be turned into legend. It matters because it shows that human evolution once held more forms than the present contains. It matters because its body does not fit our expectations, and because our expectations were too narrow. This is where the lesson becomes gentle but serious. Homo sapiens survived, and because we survived, we have built memory around ourselves. We named the fossils, we measured the bones, we placed the island on a map of human origins. but the act of naming should not become ownership. We are not the center of the past simply because we are the ones still here. We are the remaining branch looking back into a forest of missing branches. Some of those branches are known through rich evidence. Some are known through fragments. Some may never be known at all. Flores gives us one branch clearly enough to change the shape of the tree, but not clearly enough to let us pretend we understand everything. That boundary is worth respecting. It teaches the listener that science is not weaker when it admits uncertainty. It is stronger. A careful statement can be more powerful than a dramatic claim. A revised date can be more trustworthy than an exciting date. A limited fossil record can still carry a wide meaning. When we return to the beginning of humanity, this becomes even clearer. Our lineage began in changing landscapes, among animals, climates, dangers, births, and losses. It did not begin with a promise that one species would one day explain all the others. Human evolution was branching, local, fragile, and unfinished at every moment. Homo floresiensis lived inside that same process, but on an island where water turned separation into destiny. Their small body may reflect ancestry, adaptation, isolation, or a combination still being studied. Their tools show practical action, but not the full mind behind it. Their disappearance suggests vulnerability, but not one certain final cause. Every honest point leads to another open space, and that open space is not empty, it is where humility belongs. Thanks for watching. For the viewer listening at night, the value is not only learning that a strange human species once lived on Flores, the value is learning how to think about the human past without forcing it to flatter us. We can accept that another human form endured without becoming us. We can accept that small does not mean failed. We can accept that silence does not mean nothing happened. We can accept that being the last human species is not only a triumph, but also a sign of loss. The Earth once held more human variety than it holds now. A cave on Flores kept a small part of that variety from disappearing completely. Did not give us a full answer. No, it gave us something quieter and perhaps more important. A reason to look at our own survival with less pride and more care. If one island could preserve some unexpected human path, then the human story may still be wider than the fragments we have learned to read. Near the end of this long path, the island of Flores begins to feel less like a distant place and more like a quiet mirror. It reflects back a version of humanity that our present world has almost forgotten how to imagine. Today, every human face belongs to Homo sapiens. Every living human body carries the same broad species identity, despite the wide differences between individuals and populations. This makes the world feel simple. It makes humanity feel like one story. But Flores reminds us that this simplicity is recent in the deeper scale of time. Before the present narrowed the human family to one surviving branch, the Earth held other human forms, other bodies, other histories, and other ways of belonging to a landscape. Homo floresiensis was one of those ways. Small, island-bound, anatomically unusual, and known only through limited evidence, this human branch does not fit comfortably into the story that modern people often tell about themselves. That discomfort is exactly why the species matters. It prevents the human past from becoming too smooth. It prevents us from thinking that survival always belongs to the largest brain, the widest expansion, or the most visible technology. It asks us to remember that survival is always local before it becomes historical. A body survives in a place. A population continues through births, food, shelter, movement, knowledge, and chance. Only later, if evidence remains, do distant descendants call it history. On Flores, the place was small, separated by deep water, shaped by volcanic land, forests, caves, animals, and ecological limits. Within that world, Homo floresiensis endured long enough to leave bones and tools behind. That is not a small fact. It means that another human possibility held its ground outside the road that led to us. This brings the story back to the beginning of humanity, not as a straight line, but as a branching field. The earliest members of our broader human lineage emerged in Africa. Then different populations moved, separated, adapted, mixed, and disappeared across immense spans of time. Some branches became known from many fossils. Some are known from fragments. Some are known through traces in DNA. Some may never be known at all. Homo floresiensis belongs to this wider and more fragile map. The species shows that human evolution did not only move outward into open spaces, it also entered enclosed worlds where water could turn distance into isolation, and isolation could turn a population into something unexpected. The island did not make them strange for our entertainment. It preserved a reminder that our own expectations are not the measure of evolution. A small body was not a failure if it worked within the limits of that world. A simple stone tool was not meaningless if it served a real task. A species that vanished was not worthless because it did not reach the present. These ideas matter because they change the emotional center of the story. At first, the title may sound like a puzzle about a weird human species. By now, the deeper puzzle is about us. Why do we assume that the form of human life that survived must be the form toward which everything was moving? Why do we treat disappearance as proof of inferiority? Why do we feel more comfortable with a clean ladder than with a branching tree full of broken limbs? Flores does not answer these questions directly. It gives us evidence that makes the questions harder to avoid. The cave at Liang Bua, the island setting, the revised timeline, the small body, the stone tools, the uncertain disappearance, all point toward one careful understanding. The human story was wider than the human present. Yet even this understanding must remain gentle. We cannot restore the lives of Homo floresiensis completely. We cannot hear their voices or name their final generation. We cannot say with certainty why the last traces ended. What we can do is hold the evidence without exaggeration and allow it to change our sense of what humanity has been. In that quiet change, the island becomes more than a place of fossils. It becomes a place where the surviving human species learns to look back without assuming that it was always the answer. The story of Homo floresiensis is also a lesson in how to carry wonder without breaking truth. Wonder is easy when the subject is strange. A small human species on an island, separated by water, known from cave bones and tools, seems to invite dramatic language. But if the wonder becomes too loud, it can cover the very evidence that makes the story valuable. The safer wonder is slower. It does not need to say that every question is solved. It does not need to bring the species too close to the present if the dates do not support it. It does not need to invent a final meeting with Homo sapiens, a final disaster, or a complete picture of daily life. It can remain with what is known. Flores held an unusual human branch, small-bodied and distinct in important anatomical ways, living in an island ecosystem that shaped life through limits. The cave at Liang Bua preserved enough to show this branch was real, while also preserving enough silence to remind us that the past is never fully returned. That balance between evidence and silence is the heart of the lesson. Human origins are often told as a story of becoming more brain, more movement, more tools, more control, more reach. But Homo floresiensis shows that some human histories were not about becoming more in that visible way. Some were about remaining within a small world. Some were about fitting a place rather than expanding beyond it. Some were about continuity that later people might mistake for stillness. This does not mean the Flores branch was better or worse than ours. It means that evolution does not rank life by the standards of the branch that survives. A population either continues under its conditions or it does not. For a time, Homo floresiensis continued. That fact alone deserves respect. It connects them to the deep beginning of humanity, when the human family was not one species looking toward one future, but many populations moving through different landscapes, separated by climates, rivers, mountains, sea channels, and chance. Our own branch, Homo sapiens, came from that same unfinished world. We did not stand outside it. We were shaped by it. We survived through a mixture of flexibility, social life, movement, population strength, and luck. Because we are here now, our path can feel obvious. Flores reminds us that it was not obvious. The disappearance of other human forms means our survival is also surrounded by absence. We live after a great narrowing of the human family. This is why the final message should not be pride, it should be care. Care with evidence. Care with words like primitive, advanced, strange, and failed. Care with the temptation to turn a small fossil record into a complete drama. Care with the way we place ourselves at the center of the past. Homo floresiensis asks us to see that a human species can be unfamiliar and still be fully part of human evolution. It asks us to see that a vanished branch can still teach the surviving branch something important. The lesson is not that humanity was destined to become us. The lesson is that humanity once had more shapes than the present remembers. Some of those shapes crossed continents. Some lived in cold regions. Some left traces in our DNA. One lived on Flores, inside an island world whose boundaries both protected and constrained it. When that branch vanished, the word human became a little narrower, even though no one was there to record the narrowing. To remember Homo floresiensis honestly is to let that loss remain visible. It is to say that the past is not less meaningful because it is incomplete. It is to accept that a few bones and tools can carry a great responsibility. They ask the last surviving human species to be humble before the lives it can only partly know. In the end, Homo floresiensis leaves us with a form of knowledge that is both small and immense. Small because it rests on fragments. Bones from a cave, stone tools, animal remains, layers of sediment, and dates that must be handled with care. Immense because those fragments widen the meaning of the human past. They tell us that the Earth once held more than one way of being human. They tell us that an island could preserve a branch so different from ours that it still unsettles the imagination. They tell us that survival is not always expansion, and disappearance is not always failure. On Flores, a human population lived within limits that were not chosen by them, but given by land, water, ecology, ancestry, and time. Their bodies did not become ours. Their tools did not lead to our later world. Their story did not pass into writing, memory, or inheritance. Yet for a long while they belonged to the earth as fully as any living human branch could belong. That is the quiet educational value of their existence. It teaches us not to confuse visibility with importance. The branch that survives is not automatically the branch that gives meaning to all others. Homo sapiens survived, and because we survived, we now study the dead, name them, arrange them, and ask what they mean. But we should do this without turning ourselves into the purpose of the story. Our own origin began inside the same fragile process that shaped every other human form. Climate, food, movement, birth, separation, cooperation, accident, and loss. We became the last human species not because the world promised us that position, but because history, biology, and chance left us here. Flores asks us to feel the weight of that. To be the last is not only to be successful, it is also to stand after a disappearance so large that most of it cannot be recovered. The cave at Liangbua gives back a little of what was lost. Not enough to make Homo floresiensis familiar, and not enough to solve their ending, but enough to make our loneliness as a species visible. Once, the word human had more shapes. Some were tall, some were small, some lived across continents, some remained on islands, some mixed with others, some vanished before leaving more than a trace. The story of Homo floresiensis should therefore end without a closed door. We can say that they were real. We can say that their known evidence belongs to Flores and to a deep prehistoric world. We can say that their bodies were unusual, their island mattered, their tools mattered, and their disappearance remains uncertain. We can say that the old claim of survival until a very recent date should be treated carefully, not used as a fixed conclusion. But beyond those careful statements we meet silence. That silence should not be filled with false certainty. It should be respected as part of the record. For the listener, perhaps the final value is this. The human story is not only a story of what we became, it is also a story of what could exist, endure, and vanish without becoming us. Homo floresiensis was not a monster, not a myth, not a failed draft of modern humanity. It was one island answer to the ancient problem of living. Its answer ended, while ours continued. Yet the continuation of our answer does not erase the dignity of theirs. Somewhere on Flores, under stone, soil, and time, A few fragments still remind us that the human family was once wider than our memory, and that the surviving species should look back with care. If another kind of human could live for so long in a small island world and then disappear almost completely, what else about being human has vanished before we ever learned